1st, 2006. Can we rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? And Mr. Ridgeway, please lead us.
Please follow me in the pledge of the flag of our great nation. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Can you have the roll call next, please?
The record will show that all council members are present.
I move the whole agenda.
Mr. Nichols
Motion is
already
out
went
of
through
order.
it once.
I'm sorry. Continued business. The general plan update, review of draft housing, noise, harbor, and the elements. Shall we waive the staff report? Is that what we want to do, Mr. Ridgeway? No. Staff, who is going to do this wonderful honors tonight?
Mr. Tesher is going to start, and to be ably and capably supported by Ms. Wood here as we move forward. I should indicate to the committee that we, in addition to the packet that was previously distributed, have distributed to you a packet of materials. Did they receive these? Yes.
Where did we receive it?
At your desk? No.
All I got is this envelope, which has got applications on it.
Oops.
Oh, they're on the table out front? We didn't get them for council?
While they're running so quickly, as I said, capably to retrieve those, let me just explain what these are. The General Plan Advisory Committee met on Saturday for 4.5 hours. So what we have provided and what you will receive are the strikeout underlying versions. So you will see how the language has changed from the versions that you have in front of you for all of the documents that we'll be addressing here tonight as well. So I'll wait. Let me give you a preamble first about the housing element. The housing element's different from probably most all the other elements that you have seen and reviewed today for a number of key things and reasons. First is it is a document, and it's the only section of the general plan that is required to be submitted to the state, in this case the Department of Housing and Community Development, for review and certification. It's different also in the fact that because it is guided by some specific laws and specific goals and objectives under state law, its content is much more detailed. It's obviously, of all the documents we have submitted to you to date, in length it's considerably greater than what you've seen. So we have incorporated in the document in front of you all of the background and detailed information that is required to be incorporated by state statute. It also differs in that as we have been talking previously on the elements, the general plan has a long-term time frame, 20 to 25 years out. Housing element's a little bit different because the focus of the housing element is really on the next 5 years of time through the State Department of Housing and Community Development, and then through the regional agencies, SCAG. Each community is provided with target numbers of additional housing units that are to be constructed during the next time frame, the 5-year time frame as well, and usually that's a fairly bloody process of negotiation and debate between the local community and SCAG as to what that number will be, and it's referred to as the RENA, or the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, in the city's fair share of accommodating that amount of growth.
And then we all sue each other because we don't agree on that.
That's why I was mentioning the blood, which is out there. Now, if we were on a normal cycle, what you would have in front of you tonight would be the updated element, because your existing element runs through a 2005 time frame. However, the state has delayed the preparation of the numbers in the next round of what will be the fair share distribution to the city of Newport Beach. So the city has not yet been provided with those target goals and numbers for the distribution of housing units for a complete update of the plan. So what we have elected to do, and at the direction of the council previously, is to, since you have a certified element, was to only revise your existing element to be consistent with the other sections of the plan that you've already reviewed. So, for example, your land use capacities have changed since, indeed, the preparation of the last land use element, and that is reflected in the background data. You've also had actual permitting and construction of housing units since the last element has been prepared, so the data in here has been updated to reflect that as well. A number of the programs that you had in your original element that was certified by the state have either changed or funding has not been available, et cetera, and they have been modified in this particular document. So unlike the other elements where we were starting with, in effect, a fresh look at the entirety of the element, what we have done and what you will see here are all of the policies that were in your concurrently certified element have been maintained. We haven't changed those as well for you. Let me point out a couple pages in the full document beyond what was just distributed to you, a couple of key points that iterate these how this has been updated. If you turn to page 68 in your document, for example, on that page you will see a table. At the first row across the table was that housing allocation that was made at the last update, and you will see that you had at that point in time 476 units that were the commitment of the city to produce under the existing housing element. You'll see those units are categorized by the various income levels of target for the affordability. The second row there is you'll see what actually has occurred since the time of the preparation of the element in terms of actual permits or construction. And what you will see here is that you have constructed less than the very low target. You have constructed, and this is through the Bayside Seniors Project, more units than in the low category. Moderate, you have constructed 0, and of course the above moderate, which are basically your market rate and above units, you've constructed more than. And this is an indication then, this element indicates that since we are not going to be updating, I forgot to mention, the next update by the delay in the state will occur in the year 2008. So what we have done is updated all the tables and projected your original 5 years, which was to terminate in 95, forward to, 95. It was supposedly going to terminate in 2005 into 2008. So what you see here is the net remaining. Take that a couple pages further to page 72, table 36. You see then also that allocation of additional units above where you are today, distributed between your two major geographic areas of geography, the city as is, and then the numbers that were incorporated for the Newport Coast area, et cetera. So that is the background data, and we will get into the goals and policies unless you have any questions about the background sections before we get there.
I have a philosophical question or a pointed question, depending on which way you take it. It appears that all the cities throughout California are violating this to some extent. And there's evidently a velvet hammer kind of thing that's used by the state to enforce. If you just took the velvet hammer and got hammered, you wouldn't have to do anything. Is that right? In other words, there's no other constraint of theirs? Or I would like to know essentially what the velvet hammer is and how it's applied.
Today, currently there are no major, what I would call significant, quote, subventions or penalties for failures to meet the allocation in terms of numbers of housing units. Let me back away from that. There are concerns if you don't have a certified housing element, though. The state has the ability to basically shut down all development, all permitting activities within the community related to development activities if you do not have an adequate general plan, and the failure to have a certified housing element would infer an inadequate general plan. You can be sued. You can be sued on the basis of having an inadequate general plan, and there have been cases in the state where the state has basically shut down all development activity because of that. Now, that's for the failure to have an inadequate plan. Doesn't have anything to do with the numbers contained herein. In terms of the failure then to meet the numbers that are in the document, today there are no real penalties. However, there are a number of pieces of legislation pending in Sacramento There was a bill, for example, last year about this point in time that would have, if for failures to meet the targets that are established by the housing element, would have basically either taken away all or a good portion of the transportation funds that were going to be allocated to a community. This obviously is very controversial. There are currently, to my understanding, between 12 and 15 bills that will be introduced this year that are looking at two aspects, either a penalty approach or an incentives approach. Some of the things that are happening on the incentives approach through Sunny Wright Peak's aegis has been the discussion of changes of CEQA, for example, to exempt all mixed-use or infill housing projects from any requirements of CEQA if they're consistent with the general plan as a means to expedite the production of that kind of housing. That's what I call the more carrot or the incentive-based approach. Some of the author of the infrastructure penalty fee, I'll call that, use that term on transportation, is reintroducing that legislation as well.
Senator Dunn.
Yeah. So the outcomes of this right now, in terms of the question of penalties, to answer your question, is today, no. I would expect within, worst case, 2 years, that you will see something out of Sacramento that will probably be a combination of incentives and penalties approach. One of the big conundrums on the penalty approach, though, that has been wrestled with is right now we're in a healthy housing market. If you have a piece of land, you almost could get anybody to, and you can get the zoning on the piece of land, you can almost get anybody to build housing on it today. I mean, we have incredible requests to rezone commercial properties for housing, but our market always hasn't been like that and always won't be like that. We go through economic cycles. So the difficulty of holding any community accountable to a quantified number of production of housing units is the city doesn't create the market in of itself for those units to get constructed. So if we have a downturn in the economy and we're not producing housing units the same way, there's a disconnect, if you will, between the ability to hold a city accountable for that when the private marketplace isn't building housing units. So that's one of the problems. I think what I advise is you to, and your staff is keeping your eyes and ears open to what's happening in Sacramento. I'm actually going up this weekend for, actually Thursday night, for a briefing on some of this legislation, and I'll be able to actually report back to you the next time I see you about some of what I'm learning about where this legislation is going. So I would expect some form of penalties to be here fairly shortly.
I have one other thing I'd like to just ask, and that is, I understand a community just south of Santa Barbara had a survey of illegal units in their community, and that satisfied their housing needs. And my question is, why wouldn't we do the same, or why shouldn't we do the same? But it would be actually then sort of subsidizing or at least ignoring the fact that these exist in our community, which we're doing anyway. But I mean,
I don't think that we
Did you
condone
mean to say
illegal
illegal
units.
dwelling units?
we're in my community, for example, I think that there are third units in most of the duplexes. Well, not most, but at least 35 to 40% of the duplexes in Corona Del Mar.
Well, I don't think that the city would want to be legitimizing units that haven't been constructed with proper permits and may not be safe, and say that's how we are meeting our affordable housing requirement. And even if we were to somehow find a way to make that approach work, I doubt that the numbers would be large enough to satisfy our RENA goals. For another community, they might be. I knew years ago of a community in the San Gabriel Valley that was small and had a small RENA goal, and they were able to satisfy it and have their housing element certified just with using second units. But that's rare.
Thank you.
I would just say, from a policy perspective, Sharon knows the certification of our housing element is first and foremost most critical. We had a very difficult time in the last certification, despite the lack of penalties, but getting to the right numbers. I know there were many vociferous discussion by phone and in person. So I think that's the first and foremost. And as far as Senator Dunn and his friends, the League of Cities and numerous cities are opposed. So I think the incentive approach, Woody, quite candidly, is where it's headed, and not to the penalty. That's been tried and tried and tried and tried. And somehow it doesn't get it doesn't get the daylight. I don't have an answer other than pure out social engineering, which is what Senator Dunn's bills are all about, and none of those really fit Newport Beach. The cultural difference in the affordable housing that they're talking about and our city would actually be an improper planning. So that's my 2 cents worth, but obviously we all have to keep an eye on it.
One of the other, I think, major differences between this element and your last one is the whole issue of housing capacity. It's my understanding that staff were driving up and down the street with the HCD staff at the time of the last preparation, looking almost jealously for any site that could possibly constitute housing capacity. In your discussions to date, as a council and as a community, you have looked at some additional opportunities that were not considered at the last time that you updated the housing element. You're looking at capacities in the airport area. You're looking at capacities in West Newport Mesa. You're looking for opportunities of reuses in commercial areas, and none of those areas were under discussion at the time of your last element. And indeed, I think you're in a position, depending upon, again, how you make your final decisions on the plan, and of course the voters do in November, of looking at opportunities for capacities that may provide you more flexibility as you indeed approach. Because again, regardless of what we do in this round, unlike all the other elements that I think all of us are hoping, staff, and I'm sure the council and the commission and everybody is hoping that this is not going to be a 3-year update every time we have to update the general plan. You're looking at some of these, this general plan is going to have some life. The one element that you will be revisiting in a very short period of time will be the housing element, because those numbers will be coming to you within a year, year and a half. And so you'll be looking again at these policies and these programs in a relatively short period of time, and that will be coming up fairly shortly, the life of most of you, I presume, in the council as well.
Woody, I certainly would agree that adding the residential units in the airport area certainly offer us an opportunity. I guess we'll just have to see how that plays out. But
don't you also have the other mixed units areas that we're considering, like, say, the Mariners Mile, Cannery Village, some of the others? Doesn't that count, too?
They count, but the numbers are so small, Don. There's no critical mass there. There's critical mass in the airport area, and most of the other areas are onesie-twosies, and that just doesn't get us there at the end of the day. Sharon and I and the committee on housing, we've talked about that over and over and over again. We really need a critical mass, to be honest with you.
Good. Now, let me get this straight. The first 75 pages, is that essentially this of the housing element? Is that essentially the same as what has already been adopted?
It's the same, except the data has been updated to current data. For example, the housing capacities on the first 75 pages that deal with identifying sites that have housing capacity. It's been reflected to update and reflect your updated land use element. So that was not in your last element. Other sites were, smaller sites were, the RENA numbers, those 2 tables I projected, have been updated to reflect where we are today. So those are the only changes, really.
Okay, so the goals that we have now, are they virtually the same? Or how do we tell the difference between what is there today and the new?
As we walk through it, I will helpfully guide you on a go-by-go basis beginning on page 73.
All right.
I have a question, Mayor Webb.
Councilmember Daigle?
The element references mellow, and I was having lunch today in Los Angeles with the LA County Planning Director, and as you know, they used to be Malibu used to be part of them, and the conversation shifted to the coastal zone and to affordable housing, and he brought up mellow, and apparently there's a feasibility test connected to that. Can you go over how that will be applied in our element in terms of affordable housing in the coastal zone?
Let me defer to the attorney on that one.
The Mellow Act isn't applied in the housing element. It's a separate state law that we're required to address with regards to low income, specifically low income housing in the coastal zone. And there are feasibility studies involved. The feasibility studies usually work to be a determination of when the affordable house, when there's an exemption under the Act that would allow you not to provide the replacement affordable housing unless there's a study that shows that it's feasible to do so. So we address that issue currently under what we call a coastal residential development permit in our zoning code.
Okay. That's my understanding of it as well, and what I find confusing is within the housing element, it says the test of feasibility shall be initially conducted at the housing element standard. So where is that standard? What does that mean?
Well, is the question, how do you define feasible?
Feasibility, I don't remember exactly how it's defined, but it is referenced,
There's a
I
reference
believe, in the Act.
in the Act to economic and social feasibility. The word technical might be in there as well. I can't remember. And I'm sorry, Councilmember Daigle, I didn't hear your question.
It was in terms of how our housing element, how we apply MELO, which is a very important legislation in terms of the housing, affordable housing in the coastal zone. And as the city attorney explained it, it's an analysis that's conducted outside of the housing element. Yet when I look at our housing element, it says that the test of feasibility shall be conducted at the housing element level, or housing element standards. So that's why I'm confused.
What program is that? Because I thought we just
on page
referred to
60.
the municipal code.
And it may have been just kind of boilerplate type of language.
Is it on page 60?
Yes.
It's in here somewhere, because I remember seeing it.
Yeah, the test of feasibility shall be initially conducted at the housing element standard. Is that exactly what the code says?
I think what that is referring to is how the housing element defines what is a low, very low, or moderate income unit, which is the income tests and the percentages and all of that.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that would be the only application at the housing element level would be the basis and the standards. And that is what we do use when we do the feasibility, when we do the analysis to determine if a proposed conversion of units has any of the qualifying low or moderate income housing.
Thanks for clarifying that.
No, it is mentioned on page 60, the MELO requirements.
When you
There's a
refer to
program
pages,
regarding-
can you either say handwritten or typewritten, please?
Yes.
Because I'm flipping back and forth, and I'm having a hard time.
We're always referring to typewritten.
Okay, okay. So we're going to dispense with the handwritten.
For at least right now.
Okay. Well, tell
let
me when
me-
you change.
As we now go through the policies, goals and policies, let me actually refer to you. It's just thinner version, the lean mean handout, because this has the GPAC changes in it as well.
Are we going on to the policies, Mr. Mayor?
Yes, we're going on the
Yeah,
policy.
I've got a couple of questions on the stuff before the policies. Can I ask those now?
Sure.
I'm having troubles with some of the numbers here, and I just need some clarification. If I'm reading this correctly, on page 67, it talks about that in the 5 years from 89 to 94, the RENA numbers were 2,371 units. Is that right? Am I reading that right?
You're on which typewritten?
Page 67, typewritten 67, the top of the page, second paragraph.
Okay.
Yes.
And then there was a period when they had no numbers. That was a 5-year period. Then the current the current 10-year period, now the number is 476. I mean that doesn't make sense. I mean, how do you go from in a growing economy, go from 2,371 units to a lower allocation of units?
I don't know how they come up with these numbers.
So this is something that the
This-
state provided us?
No, actually, it's SCAG. The
SCAG.
state allocates the state housing need to planning regions, and then the Council of Governments, which for us is SCAG, allocates them. Initially, SCAG allocated to each jurisdiction, but more recently, SCAG allocates to the sub-region, which for us is the Orange County Council of Governments, and then they distribute them among the cities. I've never understood the entire computer formula, but I know it is based on regional projections of population, regional projections of employment, capacity for residential development in your community, and vacancy rate, and there may be other factors.
And I gave the CDR book to Dave Kiff. Did he give that to you, the latest edition of the California demographic
Yes.
research from Cal State Fullerton,
Yes.
which is what we use at OCOG. I happen to be the city's representative on OCOG.
So let me understand this correctly. If the city of Newport Beach were to consider themselves to be built out, and we weren't planning on having anything more than maybe a few infill units and that type of thing, would we then have a housing requirement that would be zero?
No.
In other words, even though we're built out and we're not planning on building anything else in the community, we still have to provide additional housing?
Don, let me give you the short answer. It's based on population increase, and we're going to go from 36 million to 50 million in the state of California. So every city must take their fair share of that increased population.
I just wanted to make sure that
It's not a static number.
And Mayor Webb, let me give you an example. I live in a supposedly built-out community. I was pointing to Barry Eaton earlier because he was the first planning director in that community. HCD and their recent housing element actually came into the city because the city said we have zero capacity. HCD drove around with city staff and said, what about that parking lot over there that's only used 2 weeks a year at the mall for parking during the Christmas holidays? Bottom line is HCD now is becoming aggressive, and zero communities are coming in and working with staff to, I will use the term twist arms, negotiate, discuss, et cetera, but to find capacities as infill projects. That's sort of the approach that's now being taken.
Yeah, I would repeat. I was at SCAG today in a policy session, again with, as you know, John Ferganese, Peter Calthorpe, and SCAG is pushing, and they're working with HCD on what they call the 2% Compass program, Sharon, which you know about. And they're really looking at, they're going after all these sites where there's a site up in San Francisco where only 8 days a year is the parking lot at capacity, and it's 200 acres, and they're going to reuse it and put residential on there, and actually it'll make it much more efficient and less traffic, mind you. And they're going to, out of the 200 acres, they're going to get 65 back on a reuse with residential and parking structures, and what happens is that those 8 days, I mean, people will have to come in by transit and or carpooling, but it will work. But what they did was, and I have to say, SCAG through the RENA process and the Compass process are looking throughout the state to change cultural habits and reuse these large portions of land that are lying fallow 95%, 98% of the time. So that's where it's going to happen. Now, interesting, in my opinion, we don't have that in Newport Beach. We're very unique.
Well, with our last certification effort, we had a similar experience where we drove through Newport Beach with staff from HCD, and they tried to find strip shopping centers that could be redeveloped because that was the hot new idea in Orange County at the time. And we pointed out that our pattern of development was different than in many other cities, and we didn't have that. But I believe that the only way that we were able to demonstrate to HCD last time that we had enough sites to accommodate our RENA numbers was by citing all of the infill areas where we have zoning for two-family development, and there are presently single-family units there. And we said, well, if all of those were to develop, then we could accommodate them all. And I don't think they were happy with it, but they accepted it.
As a city councilman, if I had my druthers, I would take all those and make them SFRs.
Well, that's what we're talking about as part of the general plan update.
Okay.
Okay, Mr.
Could you
Sellers.
Yeah, I still have a few more questions, if I
Okay.
may continue. And then I notice on pages 41 through 46, which is the inventory of land suitable for residential development, and unless I've missed it earlier, it's the first time I've seen where we've actually gone through and quantified the number of units. We've had some of the areas like Banning Ranch and Newport Center quantified, but now we've gone through and quantified everything, all the areas, and so we're proposing on adding 7,275 to 7,575 housing units to our existing housing stock through the land use element. Is that correct? Is that what I'm
Yeah,
reading?
and let me provide a little caveat, and this is something we had a conversation with the commission about as well. This is the theoretical maximum capacity. It was calculated for purposes of the EIR. And let me try to differentiate a little bit here. Banning Ranch is a raw piece of land. So in theory, if a developer is coming, the developer is probably going to want to develop as much of that capacity as feasible, setting aside the environmental constraints. If you had that entitlement, I would suggest that that's probably a realistic number in terms of what would ultimately be achieved within 20 years on that site. Many of these sites are reuse. For example, if you look at Cannery Village here, there's a number for Cannery Village. How that number was derived was putting a boundary around the entirety of planning of Cannery Village that we have worked on before and is suggested as a possibility for mixed-use development, and then taking that and calculating the acreage within that area, and then multiplying the density times that acreage. Now, that is an assumption that 100% of that area is actually going to be fully redeveloped for housing or mixed-use development in that time frame. And I think the reality of any of us who have worked in reuse projects for existing urbanized areas knows the reality is that 100% of the area really probably is unlikely to turn over during the next 20 years. So what you see here in terms of numbers is this is what I call the theoretical maximum highest number that would result if one were to make the assumption that 100% of the area is turned over. So while this is the high-end number, your reality is probably less than 50% of this number.
Okay, now what are we using in our traffic model? Are we using the theoretical high number?
Yes.
So we're loading the streets up with, 50% on these additional housing units of trips we're never going to see.
That's correct, because we took the worst-case, highest-end numbers for the purposes of the EIR. Yes.
Can I respond to that real quick, Ed? The concept with the 2% compass and the reuse that we talked about earlier, there's a dual purpose besides culturally trying to get people to work and live in the same area, and that is a concomitant reduction in vehicle miles traveled. So the byline at the state and regional levels is on these reuse projects, as we're talking about, is actually getting a VMT. Even if you do all this study, you should be able to get the VMTs down because people will not be coming regionally. They will be there locally. And so the goal, if we just concentrate on trip ends, then we're cheating ourselves. But if we look at VMTs, which is, again, state and regional, and the Institute of Traffic Engineers, it's working very well. And we actually have a couple of case studies on the ground where VMTs have actually been reduced. Now, the trip ends may be greater, admittedly.
And just to reiterate that point, if you remember the analysis of Mr. Winslow when he was here talking about the circulation element, we end up with a slight increase in trips over the existing general plan, but our congestion is actually reduced for some of those reasons.
Well, I don't disagree with you, Councilman Ridgeway, but I think that the one thing is that we've got a system here that's built on the traffic phasing ordinance that regulatory-wise we're dealing with the trip ends and not the VMTs, and that's kind of what we're stuck with dealing with here, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully we got to start looking toward the future where everybody's going on this whole analysis. So if our GP, and again, our traffic phasing ordinance is also a revenue source for us. So, I think it works from a revenue point of view, but from an understanding of the global environment within which we live and work, and we're working this GPA, we've got to look at both, and we're in a change. It's very this is very difficult. This is not easy stuff, And, I happen to think we've come a long way with this general plan amendment in addressing some of these issues. Whether we're cutting edge, I don't think so. But I think we're doing a lot of the right things in our land use, which ultimately will reduce congestion.
Well, I guess the thing that concerns me is that, at some point, we have to start simplifying this stuff for people to understand, and we'll end up with a table probably similar to what we had when we first started looking at all of this, and if we have a lot of phantom trips in there, it's going to make it look worse than it is. It's going to be used in that way as opposed to what's realistic, so that's something that when I see this, it concerns me.
You're not wrong.
One quick little thing on page 44, the paragraph right above Lido Village, third line up on the right-hand side, it says density ranges.
That may be.
Okay.
That's what we want, isn't it?
I think it's probably averages, but Mr. Selich, you had some more?
Okay, I just have one more one more question, and I guess this RENA thing looks like it's somewhat erratic, but why can't we take that model and do some projections of our own through the life of our general plan to at least get some kind of idea of the scope of magnitude of what our RENA demands are going to be?
We don't have access to the model. Many years ago, when I worked for another city, we were unhappy with what had come out of SCAG directly at that time, and tried really hard to understand the model and challenge the numbers and do our own, and simply could not get there. And in the end, finally said, we'll just put the SCAG numbers into our housing element as our goal and do our best.
Ed, to answer that briefly, SCAG has delegated it to OCOG, Orange County Council of Governments, and the modeling is done by CDR out of Cal State Fullerton, and they're accessible. Again, that book that I handed to you at least shows projections, that type of thing, but it is complex, and it's tied up in the regional housing needs assessment and the way that whole Byzantine authority is written. But at least it's at a local level where the 34 cities are all represented at the table with the same information, and then planning directors and assistant managers are all given that information. Patty, do you have any?
A possible answer to one of Councilmember Selich's first questions related to how come the most recent version of the RENA numbers are so much less than they were in the earlier decade. I think that at least in some measure is due to the fact that the cities have been much more aggressive in managing the data building process that the regional modelers used to prepare the RENA numbers. One thing that we started realizing was that they had just absolutely incredibly huge employment increase predictions for the city of Newport Beach, and we knew that both on an existing basis and a potential future growth basis, that those were just so far different than reality, and we were able, through providing a number of data in a lot of different ways, to really get them to recognize that, and I think that is at least in part an explanation as to why the number came down so strongly.
And just a quick aside, there really is a lot of infighting at OCOG and at CDR on this whole issue. So if you're not at the table representing this city, then everybody else is going to dump on you. It's done very rapidly, very quietly. So it is important for this council, because I'm rotating off of COG probably in April. It is important for everybody here at the table to know we need representation. The planning directors and assistant city managers can only do so much. The fight, the battleground is in those meetings. And again, I can't stress enough to whoever is going to take that position, Maybe it'll be the new guy who's not here.
Wait a second, I thought that Councilmember Daigle was
I think
interested in that position.
Yeah, clearly, if she, I do believe that's correct, and she would be the District 14 representative at COG, and at COG also. There's two. You have two positions once you're elected there. But it's important to get into that infighting on housing.
Let's go forward on.
Yeah, well, I was trying to rationalize these numbers, and so if we take, your statement that we're only going to get half of the 7,500 units, that's about 3,800 units. So that's what we're creating in the way of housing. Then I'm looking at these RENA's numbers, and I'm saying, just in my own simple analysis, if those numbers increase 50% every 5-year period, there's a big gap between the number of housing units we're adding and what the RENA numbers are. And what are some of the reasons we're adding the housing units besides RENA? Is that the only reason, or do we have other reasons that we're adding?
I think that's really a question for the council to answer, but what I recall from earlier discussions was that there was a desire to revitalize some areas such as Mariners Mile, and on the peninsula in West Newport, on the Balboa Peninsula, we have some old commercial, more commercial than the market will support, and the market is supporting residential. There was an interest in the airport area and in Newport Center to provide residential closer to where people are working, and certainly there's market demand for that as well. But there's certainly the housing element law isn't forcing the city to provide more housing beyond what the RENA goals are. That's a local choice.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, I just got one other one. And
Wait a
that's,
second now, this is, are you sure? This is
yeah,
the
this
last
is it.
one other.
I feel like Columbo here. On page 68, that table that you showed, the remaining RENA allocation, and in the low category, we overbuilt by 42 units. Don't we get credit somewhere else for that?
That's a good question.
And it just seems like you'd get credit,
You ought to
at least
at
in the
least get
moderate
credit in the
category.
moderate.
I'll ask Kathy when I see her Thursday.
You might get credit for the moderate, but when
I was just
when we
curious.
report every 5 years or however many years, you actually end up updating the element. You report on your progress, so we show, how many units we provided in what income category, and we talk about what constraints prevented us from meeting the entire need and what we did to achieve what we did. And there's, at this point, no sanction for not having achieved or not achieved. The really important thing that I think HCD is looking for are that you accept the numerical goals that come from the RENA process, and that you have sites to accommodate those units, and that you have programs that will encourage and facilitate the development of housing at all of those income levels.
Okay, thank you. Let's go on to the goals then.
I have one question before we go there.
Okay.
I was noticing handwritten 49, typewritten 40, 41. It talks about the airport area. Is this consistent with our land use element?
It's consistent with the land use element as the council reviewed the policies. We're
Okay.
using actually a higher number for study in the EIR, but after that number was set and you were reviewing the land use policies, you brought it down to 3,300.
Okay. I have some questions about the language. In the first paragraph, it talks about 65 dBA being, which is unsuitable for residential and other noise sensitive uses. Let's take, for example, the property owner at Commerce Plaza comes in, and I know our urban design consultant and others have noted that's a good parcel for development of housing because of its size and other factors. And yet, what we're talking about here is we're saying it's unsuitable. Is that going to create problems if they were to come in for a general plan amendment? We'd say, okay, well, you're okay in the land use, but gosh, we have this language in the housing element that creates inconsistency.
I don't think so. I think that and this is background discussion, not
Okay.
policy language. In the land use element, we put in specific policies with regard to the
Overrides.
noise contour and the council's ability to override.
Thank you.
Are we on goals now?
Yeah.
Let's go.
Okay. The first page, thin version, page 73, the first page of goals, policies, and programs deal with the conservation and improvement of housing. Let me indicate again, the question that was asked, were any of these different from the existing element? And the answer is no. The goal and the policies are the same. The programs have been modified slightly to reflect current state-of-the-art. In the programs, the content and the substantive direction is the same. I should note that one revision was made through the Planning Commission discussion on Program 1.1.3 at the bottom of the page. In the second line, there's a reference to occupancy by low and moderate income households. This should also incorporate very low as well, since the technical categories of affordable units are in the very low, low, and moderate category. And those are the only changes. GPAC made no changes to this section.
Actually, I see there are a couple of changes from the existing housing element. There was a policy regarding reducing the potential for criminal activity by safe design, which we deleted because that's something that our police department does anyway as they help us review projects. There was another program about encouraging the California State Franchise Tax Board to enforce some provision of the taxation code, and that was deleted because it didn't seem to be something that the city attorney needed to be spending time on, and the state should enforce their own laws. And then some other programs were moved to a different goal where they were more appropriate.
Okay. Are we on goal 2?
Okay. Goal 2, beginning at the top of page 74 and running over to the very top of page 76, addresses the issue of provision of a variety of housing opportunities. The program, you see 2.1.3, again, the goal and the policies are the same as in the existing element. Program 2.1.3 has been retained, but it's been moved to another section because it's more appropriate in another section as well. Let me indicate that this was an area that actually the Commission spent a fair amount of time of discussion, particularly as it relates to programs 2.2.1 at the bottom of the page and rolling over to program 2.2.2 in the top of the next page. There was a fair amount of discussion about the requirement for the average of 20% for the inclusionary requirement for affordable units. There was some discussion about, is that percentage first commensurate with what other cities are doing? There was a question about, is it too high in Newport Beach? Should it be lower? The question pertained to should indeed that number be reduced to reflect the fact that the capacities may increase by the provision of housing at the airport and other areas of the city as well. So there was some degree of if you will, fuzziness about the appropriateness of that number being embedded into the plan as well. This is the number, of course, that's in your certified element today. Outcome of that was the Commission was uncomfortable with making any recommendation about that number at this point in time and asked staff to take a survey about what other cities are doing and to come back to them with some sense about what other cities are doing in terms of inclusionary housing requirements, because there's a reference, for example, that Irvine right next door has a 15% requirement instead of a 20% requirement, et cetera. And so there was some, as I said, request. Commission basically wanted this to be passed on, but the indication to the council that they want staff to take a look at the reasonableness of that number and come back with a further report on that.
You know what, that's understood. I do have a question, though, on Housing Program 2.2.2 that you did reference there, Woody and Sharon, where we give assistance and you say more than 20% of the units. I don't like more than. What I'd like to see there instead is not less than, so we could limit it to 20%. I don't know how other people feel about that. I understand the assistance, but you know what? What's more than? Than 20%. I mean,
well, that would be up to the city council to decide when you're deciding whether to provide some financial assistance to a project. But the reason that we've drafted the policy this way, and I think this is not a change from the existing, was that the 20% is the city's requirement. And so that's what the developer should provide without any assistance. But we're saying if a developer is willing to go beyond that basic requirement, then the city would provide some
Sharon,
kind of
and I
assistance.
rest my case, and I understood it that way. But when you say more than, you're opening the door, and I don't know, there's no discretionary standard there. At least, if you say no less than 20%, now council, you can play around with the number by the dollars you give. And I just think, when you say more than, I don't know what that means, but not less than, I'm clear that it's at least 20%, and then council can determine how many dollars they give and how much more they get. So that, I just think, it's just one little word, but it changes, it gives the council a better discretion to deal with it, that's all. Because the way it's written is just fairly hard. It doesn't give an adequate standard, but not less than clearly gives one. That's my only thought.
We didn't have any justification for the 20% number either, that I heard.
From the state.
Yes, we did.
What was that?
20% of our total RENA number for the last element was in the very low, low, and moderate category. So,
But the 15% that Irvine had was equally justifiable.
I have no idea how Irvine came to 15%.
But I mean, you got this from RENA giving it to you, this 20%?
No, we used the RENA numbers and calculated 20% from them.
Because there was a big discussion that seemed to indicate that 15% sounded like a much better number to use.
It might sound like a better number, but it's not based on anything for
But you're
Newport
saying
Beach.
yours is based on some equation that you can justify?
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. I'm sorry.
I got a couple questions myself. On 2.1.1, do we still go through the
Yes, we do.
rental rates and make sure that condominiums aren't converted unless we have more than, was it less than 5%?
5, yes.
Okay.
And that's in ordinance.
All right. Now, under the 2.2.1, in our our affordable housing committee, were we still saying that projects of fewer than 50 can get by with paying in lieu fees? Or I thought that we had a higher requirement for them to, and like if you had 10 units or so. Where am I hearing that from?
This is a slight change from the existing element, and it comes from our work on the ordinance for the in lieu fee. The existing element says that projects with 10 or fewer than 10 units must pay the in lieu fee. And the city attorney's office thought that had the potential to give us some difficulty. And if we were just to put it into two categories of the projects of 50 or fewer that have the option, and then the ones that are 50 or greater must provide the units, then in all likelihood we would have the same outcome where the smaller projects would choose to pay the fee, and we would not be requiring a fee of them.
Okay.
So the ordinance will be coming to you in that form, and so we just wanted to make the element consistent.
Anybody have any other questions on the goal 2?
Was that the conclusion we reached in the Affordable Housing Task Force, 50 units?
Yes.
Okay.
Could you explain your weighting on the moderate? And that was in a table that I think it might be worthwhile, that if you were in moderate housing, you'd get a lesser percentage, and if you were in very low, you get a higher percentage.
Yeah.
So
This is on page 71, typed page 71 of the element. And in fact, the Planning Commission recommended that that level of specificity come out of the housing element and be left just for the ordinance. And again, this is work that we've been doing on the ordinance for the in lieu fee. And what we've said in the element is that an average of 20% of new units should be affordable to very low, and moderate income households. Well, if a person provides 20% of their units for moderate income households, that requires less of a subsidy, if you will, than if someone provides 20% of their units for very low income households. And so these varying percentages were calculated so that regardless of which income level you're providing for, the financial burden on the developer would be the same.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions on goal 2? All right, let's move
I
on to goal.
appreciate the last because I think it does give us a better understanding of that.
Okay, let's move ahead to goal 3.
Goal 3 addresses the topic of adequate residential sites. There was, again, the policies and goals. Goal itself was, all of those were written in accordance with the language in the existing element. The commission did make a recommended change to policy 3.1. And let me read it. It makes a change at the very end. Mitigate potential governmental constraints to housing production and affordability by increasing the City of Newport Beach role in facilitating the construction of, and then they struck the word affordable and moderate and upper income ownership, and then reads construction of housing to all income groups. So added to
Affordable
all
to.
income groups at the end.
Affordable to.
Affordable to all, I'm sorry, income groups.
So in other words, wait a second, so this is the planning commission, so they struck everything after, the thing you handed out to us today,
Yes,
they struck everything after affordable,
yes.
and then they said all
To all
income
income
groups?
groups.
To all income groups, so,
Construction of housing affordable to all income groups. And there are significant changes from the existing element here, because this is where we change the sites for housing to be consistent with the new land use element.
Who made that change to the planning commission?
Yes.
Does GPAC agree with that?
They had not seen.
it means the same thing.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, I don't have.
I think it's
Anything
more
else?
clear.
Okay, under the
Oh.
added 3.1.3, where it talks about review and consider, in accordance with state law, the waiver of planning and park fees and the modification of development standards, for example, setbacks and lot coverage at the discretion of the city council. Does that mean that if we're putting in low and moderate income housing and we reduce the setbacks and we increase the lot coverage, that we're going to be creating perhaps less than desirable housing?
Well, first, that's not a new policy. It's merely been relocated. It used to be 2.1.3.
I had the same question when it was in the other location.
Okay. There is, state law says, and I believe.
State law requires this.
And I
Does it
believe that.
require us to do it, or does it require us just to consider it?
It requires
At your
us
discretion.
to give a density bonus or other incentives of equivalent financial value.
And it does suggest.
So that could
waive-
increase the FAR.
Waive your development
Of
a site.
standards as well.
Now, our municipal code does provide an automatic waiver of some fees for affordable housing, and there are others for which our municipal code says it's at the discretion of the city council, and I never remember which is which.
I'm not so
sorry.
much concerned as a way of the waiver of the fees as if we start getting rid of
Standards.
setbacks, and if we start
Yeah.
significantly increasing densities to accomplish this, then I think that we end up impacting perhaps adjoining land uses, and we end up creating an undesirable
Well, for density,
mix.
if it's an affordable project beyond what is required by our 20% or whatever percent we end up with, then state law says we must give a density bonus. The waiver of parking, although not listed here, but it would be a planning standard for the senior affordable project at Lower Bayview. We did give a parking waiver because there are numerous studies that show that for senior affordable housing, the demand for parking is less. That doesn't mean that the same thing would be done for a family project.
They need a bigger parking space for their Cadillac, but.
And I think that it doesn't show in underline because the policy was relocated, but I thought that GPAC added the phrase "in accordance with state law."
Not it.
Oh, okay.
That's the other one.
All right. I see it.
I believe if you look at most of the affordable housing projects that came online in the city in the late 80s, early 90s, they did so because there were density bonus, there's waivers on certain relaxed standards and so on and so forth. I mean, given the land values of our community, you just can't get there without those types of concessions. So I support that. I think it's a step in the right direction, and I think it will lead to more viable types of development.
Okay. I have a question on 3.2.3. I realize this isn't a change. So when I read that paragraph, it says, when requested by the property owners, the city shall approve rezoning and developed or vacant property from non-residential to residential. So in other words, if,
When appropriate.
When appropriate.
okay, we get a when appropriate, all right. That bothers me.
Snuck in the caveat.
Okay, so the city does get to make some determinations on that.
Yes, although there have been, there's legislation since the existing element was adopted that limits a city's ability to deny an affordable housing project. There are certain findings that one has to make before one can deny an affordable housing project.
Yeah, like it's on wetlands.
But see, this really isn't talking about affordable or non-affordable. This is talking
True.
about anybody that has commercial property or stuff out by the airport or any place could come in and say, hey, we have this property, we want it to be residential, you got to let me do it. Except I guess we get to determine if it's appropriate.
That's always the city council's discretion in his own change request.
Okay. Goal 4?
Goal 4 begins on this page and runs over to the end of page 78. Again, this is the provision and preservation of affordable housing, some of the policies contained therein. The goal in the policy, again, the two policies within this section are the same as they were within the original element. And Sharon, you have the changes from the original. Are there any?
Some of the programs from Goal 1 have been relocated here because it was better organization.
Okay.
So no changes basically in the program. They're intact.
Let's move. Anybody have any questions? Goal 5?
Goal 5 addresses housing for special needs groups. Again, the goal and the policies have not been changed from their original versions. No changes by the advisory committee. Any changes here, Sharon, from the original version?
We deleted an existing program which read, continue to permit development of senior citizen housing facilities in all residential and commercial zoning districts, because we thought that that was not appropriate, that we should follow what our new land use element says and whatever zoning is adopted to implement that.
Any questions on Goal 5? Goal 6?
Goal 6 on the back addresses the fair housing requirements of state law. Again, the goal and the policy are as they were in the original version. No changes by the GPAC?
No.
I have a question back on 5 for just a minute. If a person developed a group home for handicapped or elderly, would they be subsidized by the city?
No.
So that, they would not be, there would be no restrictions on them doing that, but they would not be subsidized, is what you said.
Well, they could apply and
yeah.
request some kind of assistance from the city, and it would be the city council's decision whether or not to provide it.
Right, and I think it would largely be due to whatever benefit or need that there was that was being fulfilled by, an elder housing group home or something like that.
But specifically, we're not giving them any grants or anything to do
It's
that.
not by right, no. It would be
Okay, I
at
just
city
wondered.
discretion.
Okay, we're on Goal 6.
I understand.
And does anybody have any questions on Goal 6? All right, we have one goal under 7.
One goal, one policy, unchanged. There was a minor word modification to 7.1.1. You'll see some redundancy in terms of the use of the term "the city," so it should read, "As a part of its annual general plan review, the city shall," and then strike the words "provide information to the city council," and insert the word "report." So it'll read, "As part of its annual general plan review, the city shall report on the status of all housing programs," because the city was reporting to itself in the prior wording.
And in the existing element, there are monitoring and reporting programs sprinkled in almost every goal. We just consolidated them all into Goal 7 instead of repeating them.
Okay, any comments on 7? Okay, now, are we supposed to comment on Appendix 1 through 4?
No, not unless
Okay.
you really
No,
want to.
then I do have a question. Do you need an action on this, or do you want everything at one time?
We need to open it to the public.
This, we're doing this as study session, you're giving us direction, and then you won't actually take action until we have public hearings on the plan.
Okay, so this is a study session?
Yes.
We have to do this again and again?
Yes, you have to.
and
And
again.
again. I think there are 4 agains there.
Hopefully only one again.
Okay, okay.
Okay, would anybody in the public like to comment on the housing element? Seeing nobody rushing forward, we'll close that one, and shall we move forward then to the draft noise element?
Okay, again, we have a handout for you, which was in the recent version, which indicates the changes by the advisory committee, of which there were a fair number, so it'd be useful to take a look at this document. Before we get to that, though, let me just indicate we've also provided for you, I believe, did we not, Greg, the noise contour maps. These have been updated. The first 3 pages are a representation of the noise contours related to vehicle traffic on the city's streets and the noise contours for John Wayne Airport. This is strictly a computer interpretation of the actual traffic volumes that are actually recorded and documented on the streets, and translation of those in a model into the noise contours, the distances from the center line. And the last 3 pages then are how those contours change based upon the projected traffic increases at that worst case numbers that Councilmember Sulich was talking about earlier in terms of the build-out numbers. You'll also see here the contours for the airport. Again, to remind you, actually at your direction, the contours we have incorporated here for the airport are the contours that are based upon the A-loop, so that what we consider to be the most conservative. And we have some policies in here addressing that as well as we move forward into the policies. The document itself, briefly before we get into the policies, there are a couple of errors that were noted here earlier in the Planning Commission meeting, so let me point out to you where those errors are. But first, if you turn to type page 2, table 1, there is sort of an interesting table we always kind of find interesting in these, that when we talk about noise levels, decibels, sometimes people have a hard time sort of equating that to real life, real world experiences. So what you see here is a listing of the various decibel levels and sort of equivalent kinds of noise levels attributed to that. So you see rock bands and boom boxes, probably put boom boxes in the same category, are up there at the highest levels. And you see sort of where a vacuum cleaner and normal speech fall on this sort of continuum of decibel levels. Off to the next page, on page 3, is the city's land use compatibility guidelines for the noise environment. So it takes various categories of use that you see on the left and then categorizes them in terms of the degrees of acceptability. We have noted some errors on here, and let me just point out, for example, the schools, libraries, churches, hospitals, nursing home categories. The chart suggests that it's normally acceptable up to 70, and that is an error. So we're going to be going back and correcting that table. Equivalently, if you turn forward a couple of pages to page 10, there is a comparable table relative to, again, the land uses that we're looking at in the general plan designation. There are some equivalent errors in this table, so hold off on these tables, but we'll correct those. But the idea here is we're going to use the standards that you currently have in place. We're not reinventing the wheel in terms of the noise guidelines and standards of the city. On page 11 is the standards relative to interior noise levels, and these are, again, based upon the codes in the cities today. So I'll hold off getting into policies, and those policies begin on 11, and really ask the council if you have any questions or comments on the section up to page 11.
Okay, on page 5, the top paragraph, where we're talking about JWA experiences 387,866 aircraft operations in the year 2000. Why aren't we updating that
We're going to be
2005?
updating those numbers. Yes.
I thought we had, but we missed it.
We missed that.
Okay, good.
If I could just back up for a second, on page 4 in the context section, the Planning Commission wanted to add a couple more noise sources. In the introductory paragraph, they added boats, and somewhere we are to work in, and I understand this
They
is the...
added what?
Boats.
What's the difference between that and water vehicles?
Well, that's the separate section. They wanted it added to the introductory paragraph at the
Okay.
top.
How about motorcycles on PCH?
Where it says
Motorcycles is in there.
Oh, it already says.
How about the ones on Bayside Drive that live there?
And we are supposed to add banner-toting airplanes someplace.
Yes. That's a good one, quite candidly. Those planes aren't even certified anymore.
Nobody mentioned raucous public meeting.
Okay, anybody else have anything on our noise element up to page 12? Okay, let's go into the policies on, actually, on my piece of paper, it starts on page 11, but
Yeah. Beginning, the first section beginning on 11 and rolling over to 12 addresses the noise and land use compatibility. On a couple of changes here by both the GPAC and the Planning Commission. The first on 1.4 is just a technical change. You'll see the words continue to were struck, and that's based upon the staff's good input from the council previously to not use the term continue to through the policies here, and we have deleted that. But they also wanted to be very clear that we're not retroactively applying this policy to existing use, and it would apply to new residential projects as well. Policy N1.5, the DBA should be actually CNELs and not LEQs, but again, a technical change. Numbers are correct. The second, the nighttime standard, you will see they did recommend changing from a 60 dBA to a 50. So the GPAC recommended that. That was reinforced by the commission, who also supported that.
Can you explain that? I just want to understand what that means.
The nighttime, if you go back to that first chart about the standard of noise on page 02, you will see that it's a quiet area. It's a quieter area. They felt that the standard for 50 was a much more reasonable level, was the input from the GPAC. That a 60 was a louder environment, that they felt that 50 was more attributable or characteristic of nighttime uses.
Is that for the entire city then?
it says mixed-use development.
Or mixed use?
And it's
only
mixed use.
Okay.
And
Areas.
Table
And
4
it's
is what our
considered.
standards are now,
Okay.
right?
I'm
I mean-
now I understand.
We have right now in residential zones a 40 and 65 during the day,
Yeah,
and
65 during the day.
I understand.
not in the 70s, which is
That's correct.
related in the chart.
In 1.7, it says limit hours of commercial entertainment operations. Now, would that, in that particular paragraph, does that mean except for mixed uses?
Let me go back in that one in a moment, because they're actually, the commission made a recommended change on this. Their language, they would insert after limit hours, and it says, and/or require attenuation of commercial entertainment uses adjacent to residential. The intent is either in mixed use or when you're directly abutting, let's say you're in a restaurant, entertainment facility in Corona Del Mar, directly abutting a single-family residential area. So it means both horizontal and vertical. And attenuation could occur through, in mixed use, you normally have a 2-hour fire concrete level between the housing, et cetera. So inherently in the construction, you're mitigating some noise there.
It's my understanding the 28th Street Marina buildings have had some noise problems radiating from various different floors, and they haven't been terribly popular.
And that's why mixed use, to be my own experience in mixed use as well, is entertainment uses and any noise-generating uses in mixed-use buildings can be problematic. Restaurants that basically do not involve a lot of heavy noise levels, more of the dinner kind of establishment that might close down by 10 o'clock tends to be compatible in most areas, but any that involves any kind of amplified music or you get vibration as well is the other concern, not just noise.
Yes, my son runs a music studio. I understand he's part of that 110 dBA level music. Okay.
And then in 1.6, the change by the advisory committee, the difference from require to encourage was a reflection that there may be some side areas where you really have no capability of separating some of these functions. Indeed, it was one of the members of the advisory committee was pointing out an actual project that had been approved where the feeling, and I guess the sense was that there had been a successful integration of these and without a noise problem or an incompatibility problem, so hence the encouragement versus requiring in all cases.
Okay, anybody have any comments on policy 1? Hearing none, let's go to policy 2.
Goal 2 deals with transportation noise. A couple of comments were made by the Commission on policy N2.1. It, as written, it is a little bit inconsistent of N1.4, so we were directed at synthesizing these to make these consistent one with the other. And it's a little confusing the way it's written, and basically we'll just have one policy. On
I have a question with that one on 2.1. Now, are you saying that this is the map that's going to be used to interpret that policy?
That plus any on-site noise studies that would be required through the normal development review processes.
Because
At a
I
larger
look at this
scale.
particular map, it's got to be a lot larger scale.
Yeah.
It looks like to me that they haven't taken into consideration speed in the location of those curves, because you go through Corona Del Mar, you have the same volume that's going faster, which is a louder noise, gets to Corona Del Mar, slows down. Those contours should come in significantly.
And that's why, and unfortunately, what happens in a regular model that's computer-based is you're not able to document those differences. That's why on a project-by-project basis,
Computers
sort of
can do
anticipating
anything, and models can do anything if they're programmed
by signing the
appropriately.
data in, exactly. So, but point being, I guess is where we're going, is to that end, though, is that as the EIR mitigation, anticipating what's going to be, there is going to require noise studies, actual field studies and monitoring and noise conditions in those areas as a part of the condition of approval for development
Like,
projects.
for instance, let's say that we have a 12-foot widening on Coast Highway.
That changes.
I noticed that the contour line on Coast Highway is all the way up on the other side of Kings Road, which I know from a geographical standpoint, you have a 30-foot slope, you have a row of houses, and so that I really hate to see us use a cookbook noise standard that these lines really are meaningless. I think maybe that was my comment in 1988 also. But
Yeah. Well, again, I think you're pointing out the wisdom, if you will, of the policy about field surveys to verify and monitor the noise conditions as a part of the development plan review, because you get such, you also have the situation where even within these contours, not even
can we put a note on the
topography
map that very
indicates
loudly says, these contours do not reflect speed of the highway, topographical features,
Or Don Webb's comment.
or Don Webb comment.
with having the caveat?
But anyway, I think that we're.
I think that's important.
By including something in the document like this, I think that we're not doing our customers, if you want to call it, a service.
I would make a comment, though, in Corona Del Mar, that the nighttime speeds that we're seeing are over 60 miles an hour through town and in the morning as well. and we have a speed demon here to prove it. I think you've said that more than once, have you not? That the speeds in
Robin would never
Corona del
exceed the
Mar-
speed limit.
Take the fifth, Robin.
As the
Take the
attorney.
fifth.
That convertible BMW.
So we will make that caveat. I think it's an important caveat. We will recognize
I'm really pleased that Councilmember Nichols did point that out, that this, in the mornings, the speed in Corona del Mar, through Corona del Mar is 50 miles an hour, so that we have no congestion in
Yeah,
there.
I
We don't
remember
have
the
to worry about
congestion
it.
discussion, yes.
That's because we made all those islands out there so we could funnel it through.
Wait a second, we're straying. Before we go any further,
I'd cut while you're ahead.
yes.
Okay, the balance of the policies on page 13, change on policy endpoint 2.3, as you see here, made by the GPAC. This was language that had been deleted from the existing noise element that was requested by the GPAC to restore. And this is basically the exemption for any issues on trucks have to then conform to the nighttime noise standards that the city has, rather than a sort of a blank exemption up above. Policy 2.N2.5 as newly numbered, the GPAC wanted to add the word and add the notion of not only to require compliance but to enforce compliance. Unfortunately, as worded, the Commission was concerned about the way it was worded because it requires that the boating activities will enforce the noise standards versus the city enforcing the noise standards. So the suggestion of the Commission was just drop the words "and enforce," because if there's a requirement for compliance, it infers, in their opinion, enforcement as well.
But that's not true. I
That was the
mean,
commission.
basic premise in law is you have an effective authority, which
Right.
is a law, and then you have effective
Absolutely.
enforcement. If you have no enforcement, you don't have a law.
You don't have the law, that's right. And
So,
that's-
I don't
so
know
they,
what-
they deleted the words.
Well, it
enforce.
wasn't my suggestion, because
I'd leave
I
the word
think that
10.
requiring compliance is enforcing.
No, not at all.
Then
You have
we can get
formal
the enforcement
authority and
notion
effective-
back in, but we have to rewrite it so it makes sense.
Right.
You agree with me?
Let me, again, I'm going to repeat. You have formal authority and effective control. Effective control is enforcement. If you don't have that, the formal authority means nothing. And all you've done is part one.
Supposing you just took out the word comply and put enforce at that point and drop out with, and wouldn't you be back to where?
We
you'd
should
both be
rewrite
saying
it
the
to
same
say,
thing.
enforce the noise standards
Require
for
all-
boating activities outlined in the municipal code.
There you go.
Right.
You absolutely should do that. Now, the Harbor Patrol will not enforce them. But, so that means we have no law.
Well, maybe we,
That's the way it goes.
take over the Harbor Patrol.
Chris Norby would love you for that.
Well, let's wait and see.
Okay.
Anything else on, I have a comment on 2.6.
2.6 is again, a reinsertion. This is added back by the advisory committee. It was in your original noise element, and the GPAC had it reinserted this as a policy regarding the provision of noise barriers along those corridors.
Okay, now can we put a caveat in there that being inside or being shown on a map doesn't justify it? It's got to,
Yeah.
it needs to be a separate study?
I think we can.
Now, do we mean
add
all
field
yard
studies.
areas?
I
For
don't-
instance, Irvine Avenue,
I
front
don't think
yards
we
along
need
Irvine
to.
Avenue. Is that something that should be noise protected? Because yard areas is more than just a backyard.
Front as well.
And there are arterials in town that are adjacent to yards that are not necessarily backyards. Dover Drive is another example. Superior Avenue has some mobile homes immediately adjacent to it in the front yard setback area. Marguerite, that's a collector street. So that they're Bayside Drive.
This policy is not saying the city must provide these barriers in every case. It says establish a program to secure funding, It doesn't refer to the map, it refers to homes exposed to noise levels above the city noise standards.
Okay.
So we could
Well,
do
Irvine
specific
Avenue and
studies.
Marguerite both qualify,
That's right.
period.
I think that one of the problems that we have in getting in there with the very general statement of yard areas is, what kind of yard areas are we talking about? Front yard areas, I don't think really are that appropriate for that type of mitigation, as opposed to a backyard area where you're going to have the playground equipment out back and the kids playing around. So I would say backyard areas rather than yard areas.
It says here at the end, the feasibility of other, well, they talk about front yards, which is what you're concerned about, right? Noise barriers are most feasible for single-family homes where the rear yards are adjacent to the roadway. So those are the ones you're saying we can't protect. And then all other situations are covered by the next sentence. The feasibility of other situations should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So,
Well, it doesn't talk about front yards. It's silent on front yards.
but that's other situations.
I think it should say rear yard areas.
Boy, I tell you, I hate silence, guys. Somebody with a front yard that's noisy.
Yeah, what if you have a front yard that sides onto, what if your property sides onto the street and your backyard is on the street and your front yard is on the street? Does that mean we only wall off the backyard, not the front yard?
Yes. Yeah.
Or, well...
Well, I think
the
that
other
would come
thing-
under the where situations should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and I think
Okay,
the language probably
let's
covers
take
it.
it one step further. If, would these walls or noise attenuation measures be allowed in the front yard setback area?
Well, it could be just, I mean, I know people that have their front yards, they have a pool in the front yard, so maybe that is their
But they're
area.
not on an
Front yard
arterial.
setback. I guess one of the, what I'm trying to avoid here is on some of our streets, if we put walls to attenuate noise adjacent to arterial highway, we're going to create a Garden Grove type situation where the walls are out right at back of sidewalk. On the streets, there are some problems with the driveways going in and out on roadways like that. So that I think we have to be very careful with this type of statement, because as soon as we put that in, we have a number of people that are going to be coming to us and saying, well, gee, your policy now says that you're going to build noise walls in front of my house.
No, it doesn't say that.
It says you're going to set up a program to allow it to be done if requested.
Problem is, Don, a lot of those places are duplexes, so you'd have to have noise walls 2 stories high to do any good, and that isn't going to work either. Then you completely messed it up. So I think you're right. You probably want to take it out altogether.
Just use rear yard. I think you solve it by just saying rear yards. And then the last sentence should remain the same on a case-by-case basis. The problem is Marguerite and Irvine Avenue especially. It's very noisy along there.
There's a problem all along Coast Highway, too. There are many residences that are within the 65 dB zone of Coast Highway.
And some of those, well, okay, this is a real hornet's nest for the city in the future. I'm just
I
making a
think
statement.
that's why the policy is as long as it is. I imagine that when this was introduced for the old noise element, the same discussion occurred.
Well, you might just look at it again, I guess, since this is a study session, because we're going to beat it up again. And if you have specific language that doesn't quite cover the Irvine Avenue situation, you're going to have to change it.
And with the caveat that don't use this to make the determinations.
I think the caveat will also be placed at the beginning of the section on transportation noise in the text.
Okay.
Any other questions on 2? Let's go to 3.
3 addresses the compatibility with John Wayne Airport and the noise contours. Policy N3.3 was an objective of some members of the advisory committee to allow flexibility in the noise contours, recognizing that the direction from the council was to base our efforts on the A-loop and the noise contours that are contained therein. So if you read the language that was here from the advisory committee, it says use noise level contours based upon the most likely estimate future airport contours rather than on assumptions of less likely future operations in determining allowable uses to the maximum extent allowed by law.
And I want to just say I support that. It's a nicely written and important sentence.
I think it's much better than the previous one.
You anticipated what I was going to say because you're reacting to counter to what I was going to say. What I was going to say was the commission deleted this, so your recommendation would be to restore it.
I would keep it in. I just think the most likely is it's actually well written.
I think it's a welcome addition, given the sometimes fictional character of noise contours.
Oh, I don't know.
There is a question, though.
Based on the assumptions that are
Yeah, the assumptions change.
there you go.
In our residential areas, we're saying a 50 dB noise at night, and
Who deleted that?
part of this airport
GPAC.
noise is going to occur at that time.
I'm going to put GPAC on the planning commission.
Okay.
They did good.
So is that the direction of the council?
Yes, we want to add the
Back in.
3.3 back in.
In 3.4, the commission added to clarify the curfew. There was some discussion about whether the curfew should actually specify hours, and the discussion led to a recommendation that that's appropriate in a code or some other mechanism rather than being in the general plan. So what they added after the very end of the first line where it says including but before curfew, they inserted the word existing. So it was, again, a reference to the existing curfew, and then they terminated the policy that says unless modifications benefit city residents. The GPAC added the language, actually, unless the modifications benefit city residents.
Okay, wait a second.
the
So the
planning
planning
com-
commission is saying that we should oppose any attempt, even if the attempt makes it better?
No, the planning commission just didn't want that last language. They thought that it actually confused the situation, and that the city should oppose any attempt to modify the existing restrictions and curfew.
We definitely should oppose anything on modifying the curfew, but
One of the concerns of the planning commission was who would make a determination that the modification would benefit city residents. And they thought that they could foresee a scenario where the airport itself somehow justified a change because they determined that it benefited city residents, whether the city agreed or not. And that was part of their thought process.
Maybe having more flights and round the clock is a benefit to Newport Beach residents.
I agree
That's a
with
slippery slope, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
I agree with what the GPAC came up with.
unless modifications benefit the
What was,
I mean, there could be a scenario where it benefits residents.
let's toss this to
You wanna-
Nancy. What was the thinking there on that, Nancy?
Just say something came up. That something came up that for some reason would be a benefit, and we were already written in saying, no, we oppose everything. So this was just gave some flexibility to say, if the city feels that this is of advantage, then we should look at it.
Makes sense to me.
Does to me, too. I like that old logic coming in again.
Okay. Let's,
I just hate to leave a crack in the door
okay.
Yeah.
that someone could walk through.
Okay.
The policies on the airport continue over to the middle of the next page, and there were no other changes made by the GPAC or the Planning Commission.
Okay, I have a broader scope question. Do these policies, along with everything else that we have in the general plan, conform with what the Airport Land Use Commission wants us to do to become a conforming agency as opposed to us now being a non-conforming agency?
You need to answer that.
You would know that.
I don't know, but there's a certain period of time before adoption when we need to submit the general plan to the commission, and we are working on that. So we'll find, and they have a limited period of time in which to respond, so we'll go through that process.
There's got to be some guidelines that they can give us
One
that,
would think.
of the things that we have to do to make sure we're conforming, I would think.
Well, wasn't one of them, didn't we
That's
have
a
a
mystery.
discussion about the 65 line and accepting their line, which was not the same as our line?
That's not the key element. Apparently, there are certain things that are supposed to be written into our general plan when you're adjacent to an airport that you follow when you're making development approvals in that vicinity. And Newport Beach hasn't ever done that. And the Airport Landscape Use Commission keeps considering us non-consistent, or non-conforming, I guess I should say.
It's inconsistent. We actually now believe that we know why we were considered an inconsistent agency. Jim Campbell actually worked real hard with the current director there and finally ferreted out the problem. Our existing zoning code in the height section does refer to the height limits and has a specific section regarding height limits as it relates to the flight patterns at John Wayne Airport, and we always thought that that was sufficient to deal with compliance with the height limits. Apparently, one of the reasons why they felt we were still inconsistent is because in the airport area, the base height limit map in the zoning code, the general one, has this in the 375-foot height limit, which is significantly higher than what their height limit would result in. And so I think we can put that one to bed.
Okay, well, I just like the staff to at least make one more try with the Land Use Commission to see if this new document that we spent millions of dollars on can be a conforming document.
Yes, and I just want to remind you that given the way our zoning code is written, that probably will not happen until after we do the zoning update subsequent to the general plan.
I have a question on your noise profiles, though. They're different in the two books significantly.
Yes, the one we passed out tonight is the correct one.
Now, it's quite a bit less, right? And I mean, that's the smaller noise pattern that Don is talking about
It's the
that we are
opposite.
not being asked to adopt.
It's the opposite. The one we passed out tonight is the larger contour around the airport.
So then
it's correct.
all of our area at the airport is under a 60 dB zone.
No. It's a little hard to see the colors, but essentially, it looks like Cole Center Newport is not.
Not 65, I'm saying 60.
Yes.
though.
Yes.
60 it is, yes. 60, yes.
So that is above the residential zoning limits in our city right now on the code.
No, it's 65 is the limit.
Didn't we just change it to 60? We changed something to 60.
In the airport area or something? Because
That's 65.
Yeah, it's the nighttime that we changed to the lower number. 50.
Okay.
in the nighttime, we are still in operation at John Wayne, though, till
Nighttime
11
goes till
o'clock.
10.
No takeoffs after 10, just landing.
Just landing.
Mm,
And landing's
okay.
required during the takeoffs.
That's, I'm not fighting that. We don't.
Okay, let's go on to,
60 dB zone. in
let's go on
residential.
to goal number 4.
This section addresses non-transportation related noise impacts on sensitive uses. The policy 4.3 is a policy that was added by the advisory committee to assure the appropriate relationships when you have residential and commercial uses abutting each other. So commercial corridors, for example, adjoining a residential neighborhood. One modification of this by the Planning Commission, they added at the close to the extent feasible as a caveat onto that particular one. Policy N4.4 on the top of page 15, there's actually an error in the way it's written, but for consistency with the GPAC, you should drop the word consider, strike the word consider, And the first word should read limit, not limiting, so drop the ing, so it should read limit hours, and then strike the word of, when recreational activities in parks in the harbor can take place. So it wasn't considered, but it was to be more proactive in terms of enforcement was the intent of the advisory committee. The last sentence in this policy is not deleted. You'll see is actually moved out as a separate policy because the topic is different, and so it was moved into a new policy in 4.5. And 4.6 addresses, and it was added again by the GPAC, about the limitation on maintenance and construction activity when it abuts residential areas. And 4.7 was modified to add private fireworks as a potential nuisance that the committee wanted to have addressed. And then finally, in 4.8, read that, leaf blowers, other kinds of landscape maintenance equipment. Basically says regulate the use of. Doesn't tell you how to, but it basically says that there should be some regulations on the use of that. That was added by the GPAC. Excuse me, and I should be clearer here in your version. The 4.8, the commission struck the hours for, so it would just read regulate the use of, because the commission felt that it might not be just the hours, it might be other controls.
Okay, in 4.6, does that mean that you're only regulating the noise for residential areas that result from in-home hobby or work-related activities? So in other words, if a guy has got some sort of work, that's the way it reads to me.
Yeah, it's very limiting. It's a very limiting.
I think it should be in or adjacent to residential areas and noise that results from in-home hobby or work-related.
Well, it would be and or including.
Okay, well, you need to work on that.
Including would be better, I think, yeah. We'll
work on that.
There you go. Guys working on their cars.
Yeah, that's right, that type of things. Or me starting up my saw.
My neighbors came first.
Okay, anybody have any comments on 4? 5?
Can we move on?
Anybody want to?
I have no questions on 5. Thank you.
Is that supposed to say minimized, not minimized?
No, the goal describes the end state we wish to achieve. The policies are the actions.
Okay. Noise element is over. It's my understanding, excuse me, anybody in the public like to talk about noise? Seeing no one, let's go forward. It's my understanding we're taking Mariner's Mile next. Is that correct?
Yes.
We're taking Mariner's Mile next?
You know, if we would have taken them in the beginning, we wouldn't have an audience tonight, except for Nancy.
And they've had to hear, they had the benefit of hearing this twice in one day, plus on Saturday.
I should indicate again for the, you had several packets on Mariner's Mile. We have passed out to you again tonight a document that reads memorandum up at the top, January 30th. What we have incorporated in here are the revisions to the land use element that reflect the input from the advisory committee on their meeting this last Saturday. So the underlying language is, again, the additional text and the strikeout are the deletions. And I believe you have a presentation before we get to this.
A presentation from staff?
I was going to, there was some comments related to the view corridor and whether or not we should require a strict percentage or allow the property owner to, whether we would require a percentage or write requirements that would provide for view corridors and let the applicant or developer provide the significant view visual corridors. Is that?
Yeah, let me go back to the original gestation of this, going back to the GPAC. When we had this discussion in the land use element, if you turn for a moment to policy number 6.19.9, if you can read through here the original wording before all the additions, There was a question by the council about what do you mean by about significant visual corridor. There was some question that that wording was loose. There was some wording or some consideration about the appropriateness of how one would implement that. Can specific development standards be created, et cetera? And you asked us to look at this. You asked staff to go back to the General Plan Advisory Committee to have a discussion of this as well. So in your packet, you also have a copy of what was submitted to the Advisory Committee that indicated there are two basic approaches. One is a very rigorous standards-based approach that would, for example, as you will see in the what was submitted to you, stipulate a numerical standard for how much space would be open to preserve that view corridor. The examples were taken from two coastal plans, which basically, in the examples, articulated that 80% of the site could be built upon and 20% of it shall be maintained as open space. The other approach was a more generalized approach where basic principles, design principles, planning principles would be set in place, but the actual quantity of open space on a site would be determined on a case-by-case review. The GPAC opted for that approach in the language that's in here for a couple of key reasons. One is not every parcel is the same size and the configuration in this area. You have some parcels, as the example up here, that may be 800 feet in length, where a appropriate size would be determined based upon that size of the parcel. But right next door, let's say you only have a 50-foot wide parcel, applying the same standard to that parcel may make development totally infeasible, or you result in a very narrow corridor. Let's say you take a universal percentage and it's a 50-foot wide parcel, you may have only 10 feet, and if you have a 30-foot high building or 25-foot high boulevard, you're not really getting a view corridor. So the direction that the committee opted for was for a case-by-case required visual analysis on every project that would occur within this area to make a determination on that. We can come to the precise wording, et cetera, for this as well. So that was the direction. That was the direction the GPAC is suggesting to you for your consideration.
And I think that all of this really related back to the threshold question of whether residential use should be allowed at all on the bay side of Coast Highway through Mariner's Mile. And the council had referred that back to the GPAC, and GPAC's primary concern, at least in their last consideration of it before this Saturday, was the visual corridor, and they were concerned about another project similar to the Bay Club apartments, and so that was why we spent more time on this. And some of the GPAC members had also indicated to the Ardell property owner, the largest potential site out there, that they might feel more comfortable if they could see what a mixed-use project might look like and how the visual corridor would play out. And so then the property owner contacted us that they had retained an architect and done some design study on the site, and staff viewed that, and we felt that it was really helpful to see a real-life situation and the kinds of issues that a designer would deal with in developing a project like this. So we asked them to present it to the GPAC and this afternoon to the Planning Commission, and I think it did help set up the discussion and help people understand what the issues are. So if the council is willing to see that, the representatives are here tonight too.
I'd like to see it. Other council members?
Yeah,
Let's see it.
I would encourage that. Certainly they've spent time and money. I can say about 4 years ago I saw a very similar plan from somebody.
Okay, who's going to make the presentation?
Well, while Carol's coming up here, I'd like to make an observation on this view corridor, which I agree with the direction everybody went. We had this discussion in the Boy Scout Sea Base when they expanded, and ultimately we allowed them to put their building across there. There's still a view corridor through there, but there were a lot of considerations: the speed of traffic on the highway, the access points, the pedestrian field. There were a lot of considerations to allow that use, and Coastal Commission bought into that. So I think some of those same considerations probably would play out here, but certainly it's played out very well in the written document.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I'm Carol McDermott with Government Solutions, and as you probably know, I've been working with Ardell and the landowner and several other property owners along Mariners Mile for some time, and we have participated in all of the visioning and outreach efforts on the part of the general plan. We've attended all of the meetings. We've worked to look at how those policies apply to the Ardell site, because we recognize that not only did the specific plan and the visioning plan for Mariners Mile look at ways to revitalize, but even in your own documents, I think it's pointed out on the memorandum today that the visioning process participants identified Mariners Mile as an area in need of revitalization, and that the location was considered appropriate for mixed-use development integrating residential and commercial, and it goes on to discuss other elements of that. But as we looked at how we could begin to revitalize Mariners Mile, recognizing that this is such a key site in Mariners Mile, as Ms. Wood indicated, it was suggested that maybe we needed to get into a little more detail to show the potential and how we might meet the objectives that GPAC was really trying to address. And I know a number of you indicated that it was important to you that GPAC rule on this issue. So when we developed the plan, when we began to look at how to do that, we hired a very excellent, outstanding architectural firm with waterfront, residential, and mixed-use experience all over the world. And JZMK was the firm that we went to. And we have here with us tonight Eric Zuziak, who is the Z in JZMK. And we thought it might be helpful if he were able to walk you through both the site and all of the assumptions that we asked him to look at in order to come up with a way to implement view corridors and residential and mixed use along the area. I think it's important to note that we gave him all of the standards. He has worked with everything from FARs to parking requirements to the height limit. You know, we're only allowed 26 feet here. And in that way did a study to test really what would be feasible. So I'd like you to meet Eric Zuziak, and he'll give you a quick run-through on both the site plan that led to the illustrative.
Thank you, Mayor and members of the council, for allowing us to show you this presentation here tonight. I'd like to take off this, we drop the lights down a little bit so we could see this on the screen. That would be great. When we went through this exercise, we had a number of constraints to consider in the development concept, and you can see the site location right here. This is the Ardell yacht brokerage, yacht and ship brokerage right here. Here is the old restaurant building, used to be the old Kano's, now Windows on the Bay, and this is the site location right in here. It has a 26-foot height limit. It has boat slips in front of it. There it is existing kind of a parking area right now. The buildings that are existing sit in this location and this location here. The site area is 3.64 acres, and you can see it outlined in yellow right there. The property line along the waterfront length is 700 feet. So we really had to consider how we were going to create a development concept and still allow significant view corridors to the water, maintain our height limit, and get a variety of different appropriate uses onto the site. And be able to park it all. The concept we came up with was a site plan that preserves a significant view corridor through the middle, provides retail square footage along Coast Highway in this location and in this location, and also wrapping that retail into a public plaza, thus energizing a public plaza with retail uses along that edge, providing an open view corridor here. If we were to blow this area up right here and take a look at that view corridor, you can see it over here to the left. We provided a 105 feet of open area that is public plaza. It has 4 parking spaces here and 4 here.
enough to provide a level of convenience parking and handicap parking for this retail, but allowing this to be all open area with views out to the harbor. Along the waterfront, we have 22 townhomes. Their location is here on this side, other townhomes over here. We do have a public access walkway all the way along here. It's currently at 6 feet. It could be larger, it could be more of a promenade at 8 feet or so. What we have done in terms of, one of the considerations that we really have to overlay onto this is the Coastal Commission requirements of providing visitor-serving uses and a view corridor to the water. So what we have done in choosing to wrap the retail into this location, we've taken our 700-foot water line length, and this portion right in here is 25% of the water line length is visitor-serving uses. And the reason I want to show you this is because there's been some discussion on, should we quantify, should we not quantify the percentage of open space? And I think it's also important to talk about, the percentage of visitor-serving uses, or is it more of a policy issue? In providing retail uses, we also think it's important that you have a good energizing use along the edge of that public open space, so it is an open space that is adjacent to residential right there, to where it's not going to be felt by the public that that is a public zone rather than a private open space. So we made a strong effort to really keep that look and feel of a public plaza. We've provided all the parking underground. You come into this turnaround, and then you go down right here and do an underground parking garage with enough parking to supply the retail, the residential townhomes, the office space that sits over the retail along Coast Highway, and also parking spaces for the boat slips that are in this location here, according to your current parking standards. We have also made sure that we do not have more than 50% of the developable square footage on the site devoted towards residential. We're slightly under 50%. We're like 49% residential, 51% non-residential. And that non-residential will be comprised of retail and commercial space. A couple of other things that I want to highlight also. In terms of FAR, the GPAC recommendation for commercial FAR was between 0.3 and 1.0. We are at 0.4, so we are in compliance with that. The residential density that GPAC initially had was 20.1 to 26.7 units per acre. It's not feasible to achieve on this site with a height limit of 26 feet, more than 6 units per acre. So it's actually a fairly low density project for a mixed-use development. The next slide, you can see the second floor uses of office space right here, and office space here. And I think it's kind of interesting hearing some of your comments about noise zones along Coast Highway, for example, and the applicability of the uses that are adjacent to those. We've got the townhomes along the water, and they are laminated by the office spaces between Coast Highway and the water also. Residential uses here and office space here all along Coast Highway. This is the view from Coast Highway. Let me flip back for a second. That view angle is taken if you were to be standing here in this location, looking across to this building and through the view window out to the harbor. And this kind of demonstrates how the retail would wrap around the corner and into this public plaza, and doing the same thing over here, providing at the minimum point in our concept from this point to this point here of 105 feet of open space, providing a significant view window, and that represents about 15% of the length of the waterfront. We have 2 stories building mass here, retail on the first floor, office on the second floor. And we have the similar use over here, retail first floor, office space above. This is the convenience level parking here and here, and access to the parking structure coming down here. This is landscape area all back in here. Now, when we do perspective sketches like that, we want to make sure that we base them on reality. So what we had done in taking our land plan, our concept, projecting it up through a computer model so that we get accurate representations of height, accurate representation of view corridor width, and then transition that into our perspective renderings. This is actually the computer model that rendering was based upon. So you can see the view corridor right through here out to the water, and those are the heights of the sizes of boats that are actually in those boat slips. And then we transition it right into the rendering. So you can see it's really just an overlay showing the elements that would be in that courtyard from the building massing created by the computer model based upon the site plan of the same dimensions in the site plan. Now, one of the interesting things also about the computer model is that we can take heights, various heights, and look at the view corridor. What we did here was take a height at 8 feet so that we could actually, an eye level at 8 feet, so we could actually start to see some of the foreground plaza elements, what is in the ground plane. If we were to take it down at a lower height limit, down at lower eye level down at 5 feet, you're still going to get very significant view access to the harbor. If we were to focus in on what's in that plaza, because there has been some discussion about what elements are appropriate in a view corridor, we have opportunity for public art. We have a nicely landscaped plaza. We've got retail lining the plaza. We've got some outdoor dining opportunities, and this might be a small cafe or Diedrich's or Starbucks coffee, something like that. The open view to the bay, and all of these things starting to energize this public space and really make it feel like it is an inviting place for the public to come through. And also, it's very important, I think, to have a few parking spaces out here towards the front, not back here towards the water, but really out towards the front for a number of reasons. Number one, there has to really be visible access to parking for retail to survive and be feasible. Number two, there has to be some handicap access parking out here for this plaza as well, so we have to have those parking spaces out there for that to be accessible. The level of trees or landscaping that is in this plaza can be more or less. You know, it's really just a concept at this point. I'll be welcome to your thoughts. And that really comprises the presentation.
Any council members have any questions of the presentation? Mr. Ridgeway?
Yeah, Eric, I certainly enjoyed the presentation, and I can visualize this well. In the plaza area, and you didn't stress it, but it's there, and I just want to repeat that this needs to have a tremendous pedestrian feel to it. I think the commercial does that. You didn't stress it, but I think probably a promenade along the bayfront, if we ever get a boardwalk there, and then with the commercial in there and probably a few little bistros and what have you, it'll have a tremendous pedestrian feel.
Exactly. It has to have a pedestrian-oriented scale and feel to it.
I mean, I like it. The only other comment I would make just out loud, it's a small detail, but I have to say it, that there will have to be some public parking in there for public access. We as a city, have not enforced that well, and I guess this project will have to take that into consideration. So,
yes, the Coastal Commission would require that.
Yeah, well, the parking structure will have to accommodate some free parking, quite candidly. That's a given. But other than that, I think this gives a lot of people an opportunity to visualize what can be done here.
Councilmember Rosansky?
Is the residential element necessary for this to be a successful project?
It really is. I mean, the value of the residential itself is really the driving mechanism in the pro forma that makes it feasible.
Well, why do you say that? What do you base that on?
The value of the residential square footage along the waterfront is what's going to create the largest.
No, I agree it will create the highest value, but are you saying that that piece of property is not developable for just solely commercial use?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying
and so it's really just a function of, the land is worth X if it's residential and
Well,
Y if
it's
worth
also a
commercial?
function of the parking. If you take a look at the parking that's required for residential versus parking that's required for commercial and retail, commercial and retail have some pretty large parking ratios. And you're going to have to build quite a bit of subterranean parking in order to park this. And going down 1, possibly 2 levels of subterranean parking here, there's an extreme cost associated with that. So when you take a look at the cost of the parking, whether you have residential on there or not, it's still going to be a large area for parking, because those parking ratios are going to be very high for the retail and the commercial, as well as the boat slips that have to be there, and also public parking. So the way to make that feasible on a 26-foot height limit is to have residential in there. If the height limit was much higher, then it can start to change. But I think you really need the residential as a high percentage of the development area to really make the cost of that parking structure pencil in a pro forma.
Well, just right up the street at Dover and PCH, they're putting in, and Carol's group is also representing those folks, putting in a strictly commercial project on the same street with a parking structure below, 1, maybe 2 floors below. I understand that the rents are in the $8 a square foot triple net category. There's extensive expense associated with retaining walls and improvements to the highway and various other things that are going to make that quite an expensive project, but they seem to be able to work it out without having to have a residential component.
I'm not saying it's not feasible.
I mean, you could literally have 30,000 square feet of retail space here and have surface parking and not need a garage, and that would probably be a successful project, wouldn't you agree?
I mean, that's very close to what's existing there, and I don't think that's going to be the best. It's not going to be the best use.
And well, why is that not the best use?
Councilmember Daigle?
Yes, my question might be best directed to staff. Can certainly appreciate the point about renderings and so on that are realistic, and obviously someone at this conceptual stage is going to put their best foot forward. But when you look at the planning framework, which is what we're here to discuss today, that framework that guides development, couldn't we get a project that's quite different than this and perhaps not as desirable?
Well, that's always a given in development, but if I could hazard a couple of comments for you, Eric.
Can staff answer that first, please?
I'm speculating. It depends upon the architectural quality. It depends upon the quality of the site landscape. I think one of the components that you see here and what the GPAC recommended was an attempt to get to a higher level of design performance than you would if you didn't have these objectives. You'll see principles here on components of facade modulation, of the character of the view corridors, et cetera. You can always get ugly. I mean, you can regard, even with principles like this, I think, depending upon the quality of the architecture, you will note in here one thing, one proviso that the advisory committee felt was very important, and that's listed here actually in a couple different places, and that's the proviso of the review process, because it does stipulate that any of the projects in this area would go through a development review process where the size, scale, and the character of the project would have to go through that review and approval process. So it's saying you've got to ramp up, if you will, the expectations through the review process there, and that would be the place where, if you will, the quality assurance might come into play. I don't know.
Looked at the staff report, which was very well written, and one of the points that it made is that when you look at this planning process, we have our general plan, which is a roadmap of the future, the zoning code being our implementation, that clearly something like this requires an update and implementation, or it truly is half-baked. And so is this update proceeding concurrently, or what are our intentions to have that update where we would have some teeth to all this?
It's not happening concurrently. And after approval of the general plan, assuming it's approved, then it would be up to the city council to, I would think, set priorities for which areas of the city have the zoning updated for consistency with the new general plan first, because it always takes time to get that implementation phase done, and more resources.
Is there some reason we couldn't do that concurrently? Is it more of a resource issue?
Right now, I mean, even if we were to retain another batch of consultants, you don't have staff to manage the process anymore.
Mr. Ridgeway?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to attempt to address Mr. Rosansky's concerns. I did meet with the applicant on Gateway project. I want to make a comment, and I also was in the newspaper. And I also built and have built a number of specialty centers. I'm not convinced, number one, that that's going to be a successful project. I say that very advisedly. I sat with the developer. He actually agrees that more commercial along Mariners probably is not supportable. Interesting, but he and I were clearly in agreement with that. But let's go to the more important issue of traffic. Commercial generates, one, it has a high parking requirement. I think our new code is 5 per 1,000. And on 3, let's say it's 4 acres here, and let me say on 2.2 acres, they built 56,000 square feet down at Gateway, very significant. And they were not constrained by a 26-foot height. But so it's highly parked, but more importantly, with 56,000 square feet, the traffic generation for a commercial project versus a residential is about 5 times higher. I think a residential component, I think ADT right now is right around 12 plus or minus. And I think a commercial is probably 50 cars. It could be as high as, or 70. It's been a while since I played with these numbers per 1,000 square feet. So this balanced project actually reduces traffic significantly in Mariners, significantly. Forget the pro forma for a second. And land values along there have been driven, and there's, I think the latest sale in there, which is right across the street, was the Orange County Sanitation District. They paid the equivalent of about $135 a foot. I submit to you this site's probably, and now I'm hearing some other numbers in and around the bay at about 400 and plus a foot. And that's just the market conditions. So at least the residential here really does a nice balance to the community and the citizens. It creates a pedestrian ambiance that is otherwise lacking. But in the overall mix, one, it pro formas well. 2, it offers the opportunity for wonderful frontages and pedestrian element. And 3, it just reduces traffic. And 4, and most importantly, in my comparison to the Gateway project, this type of project is very viable, short-term and long-term. It's not overbuilding. It goes to the new axiom that we've been having for about 5 years: less is more. 6 dwelling units per acre. It's wonderful. Less is more. I submit to you, just so you understand, I think those units, if they're all townhouses, if you did this kind of project, modulated the front, I think those units start out at $5 million a pop, times 22, that's $110 million on our tax roll. I hate to be so crude to do that, but I think it needs to be understood. And I don't know who's ever going to develop this project, but the market rates for land in and around the harbor right now are so astronomically high. We have to make this thing work. Otherwise, we're destined to have what we have, which is nothing. It's on the tax rolls from about 40, 50, somewhere in there. It's really on the, so, but more importantly, it just offers the opportunity here for balance.
Councilmember Rosansky?
Well, I don't want to belabor the point because it's just a study session. I just want to go on record as I really don't favor the residential on that side of the water. I think I agree with many of the things that you said, Councilman Ridgeway, but at the end of the day, we have problems there now with incompatible uses with homes across the harbor, not even homes next door, with noise and traffic and the things that go on in a commercial area. So I don't really support injecting residential there. The property is in the condition that it's in now because the owner chooses to leave it that way. There are viable uses for that property under our existing codes. He could build, as I suggested earlier, 30,000, 40,000 square feet of retail space. Granted, it may generate more traffic than the proposed project up here. I don't know. Maybe you can tell us how much retail space was included up here.
We have retail at 34,000 square feet, office at 27,000 square feet.
Okay, so we're talking about 60,000 square feet of retail and office space. I don't know, 63,000, not including the units. Right now, that property is not generating any traffic, so any project on there is going to generate more traffic than not. The reason that the values of the properties around the harbor are expensive are because people are putting high prices on them, but the value is only a residual of what you can build there. If we allow them to build 30,000 square feet, then the value of the property is less than if we allow them to build 63,000 square feet and a dozen residential units. So it's not a function of, we're creating a value there by allowing the density and allowing the residential. We're creating a value there, but the property does have value, and there are, I'm sure, 100 builders that would love to build on that property today if the owner was willing to sell it at a price that would make development feasible today, but he's not, which is his prerogative, certainly. But it's the value is a function of what can be built there, and it shouldn't be the other way around. We shouldn't declare what we're going to allow built there because of what the value or because of what someone's asking for the property. So. With that, I don't want to belabor the issue. I don't think we're voting on anything tonight, but I just don't think it's prudent to inject more residential into that area of town.
I would concur with Mayor Pro Tem Rosansky's perspective on this.
It's kind of interesting. One of the comments that you made is that the neighbors across the bay are perhaps complaining about the commercial, but yet if you allowed residential in this area, it would be a much quieter use and much more compatible with the neighbors across the bay. I think that the combination residential and retail uses that are proposed here at least do look like they make some sense. We have residential along the side of the roadway already. Of course, everybody doesn't like the residential at the Bay Club, and the Towers apartment down at the other end are also probably not one of the things because of the height of the building that people have liked. So residential is there today, and I think that I would have to respectfully disagree with both of you because I think that this is a location where it could be done. I had some questions related to the open space. Could you flash back to the existing situation? Keep going. Okay. Next. All right. One of the things that's so nice about this particular development is that as you go down the roadway, there's a setback. The buildings are along the right-of-way, even coming from both directions. You can look out at an angle. The sea base, when it was developed to try to get, at least for this direction of traffic, the maximum amount of visual space, there was an angle in there. Now go to your development. It would seem like to me that if perhaps we narrowed the opening here a little bit and could put a little bit of an angle on these types of developments, that you really could get a much more visual window to the bay than if you put your buildings in essentially 90 degrees. You're in effect saying that you have a roadway that's going to the bay, and when you get to the roadway, you quick look to the right, and you might get a snap view. But if there's some way to open the corridor at the highway, maybe narrow it a little bit at the bay, I think you could get a little bit better view corridor. And those are some of the considerations that I think are in the GPAC's recommendations that would be considered when they talk about clustering buildings and that type of thing. The other thing is along the highway, is it your feeling, I think that Woody mentioned forced or facade modulation.
Yes, if I could address that.
Is that something that, I guess I'd be concerned if you had a two-story building going right up to the front property line.
Well, what we would be doing here is having some articulation along this side, and if I could go to the rendering, which kind of shows what that would look like. We're actually would think of taking these two centerpieces and sliding those further back so that the rhythm of the existing urban pattern that's defined with buildings of this width would start to be reinforced by buildings, pieces that start to reflect that same kind of rhythm. And it's hard to see here, but you can see that there is one form, then there is an open deck, and then another form right here, then an open deck, and then there's another form, so that we are starting to push those pieces back on the second floor so that we start to break up the building mass along Coast Highway there.
Okay,
and
thank
the
you.
same would happen on the other side over here.
And what's your definition of a promenade? From an architectural standpoint, not
From a planning standpoint, I would consider a promenade to be something where people can stroll down the waterfront and have enough room to do so comfortably.
Maybe a couple passing a couple? So that's going to be something that's going to be maybe 10, 12, 15 feet as opposed to 6?
8 to 10 feet, I think, would accommodate that.
Okay, we'll need to negotiate on that one. Anybody else have any questions on this item?
I had
Mr.
a
Nichols?
question. The residential, how high would that be along the front there?
It would comply to the 26-foot height limit.
So it would be like 2 stories? So
Yes, 2 stories.
basically. And your other buildings, they will be just, if they exceed that, that's just a slope of the roof is what you're saying?
Yes, exactly.
I think it's a nice-looking project, to be
Thank
honest
you.
with you. And I think it's compatible certainly with what I'm thinking of in that area. I believe that you have a right to use the property, and I'm not looking for all apartment buildings, but you certainly have come up with a nice project.
Well, what we've tried to do is create a project that from Coast Highway, it doesn't feel like there really is any residential. That the residential is really tucked behind that. So it feels like it's all retail as it's perceived from Coast Highway.
What kind of renters would you perceive in that? I mean, you're looking at the office space would be, I guess, relatively professional, but what about downstairs?
Well, I think that the uses in the office, the spaces that are allowed are specified in the land use, and I believe they are encouraged to be marine-related uses and visitor-serving uses. So in terms of retail, visitor-serving uses, in terms of office space, I believe it's encouraged to be marine-related uses.
Thank you.
Ardell Ship Brokerage would love to have their office in that space.
Katie Ardell, I mean, the boat works. And I believe you're planning on keeping that across the street, from what I understood, right? Or, I mean...
Maybe Dan Daniels, the owner's representative, could address that question.
I notice he's been hanging back there and would like to say something. Come on up, Dan.
We call that lurking.
Lurking, excuse me.
Good evening. I'm Dan Daniels. I'm with Ardell Investment Company. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. First of all, we specifically hired Eric and his firm in order to come up with a plan that, tell us what type of development could take place under the proposed general plan if some residential were introduced into it. I think it's probably the project that was brought up at Dover is in a different zone, has a different height limit, doesn't have the constraint of providing a walkway for the public for 700 feet, at considerable cost. Doesn't have the requirement for a 15+% visual access to the bay at considerable expense. And the whole concept, I've been involved with the Mariners Mile group that did the visioning process a few years ago. And the whole issue is whether you want any residential on the site. And years ago, going back 5 years ago, working with the previous council person for the district, we did a long public process, involved a lot of people in the community up above in the neighborhood, the residential neighborhood looking down on Mariners Mile, and said, what do you want to see down there? And the first thing everybody wanted to see was something. Just clean it up and improve it a bit. And residential, you should consider residential in order to help make that happen. And we're in the same place today. The cost of underground parking on the bay side is, by definition, more expensive than underground parking on the other side of the highway because of the water table and so forth. The property owner has actually owned it for about 50 years, has gone through a number of downzoning processes and hasn't built anything on the property. That's his choice. But the reason is the limited number of uses that are available without residential. We don't feel, right or wrong, that there's a market for that. The allowed uses are hotels. This document, if you read the first paragraph, says the public doesn't want hotels. The other uses allowed are restaurants, and as someone mentioned up here tonight, the public across the bay doesn't like restaurants on the bayfront, et cetera, et cetera. So at any rate, this rendering and the proposal, I shouldn't call it a proposal, this example of what could be done here was done simply to give you and the Planning Commission and GPAC a better understanding of what could happen with some residential. The last time we were here, Councilwoman Daigle stated that she could not support something that wasn't approved by GPAC. We had a long meeting at GPAC last Saturday, and somewhere between 25 and 30 people, there were 30 people present at the GPAC meeting. I believe a number in excess of 25 were in favor of limited residential in the height limit of 26 feet. I thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. One question, how many units would you have there?
22 is the number. 22.
Remember, this isn't a proposal, this is an example.
It's a concept, and it's a way to implement the standards that GPAC had actually implemented. And I'd like to just say a couple things to stress the difference between this and the Dover property. And as Mr. Daniels said, they don't have the burden of providing a public view corridor, public access along the bay. And I think that that alone makes a difference. And that may not change your opinion, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, but I do think that those are factors to be considered. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the owner of the little site right here next door to Ardell is also here this evening, Mrs. Lasher, and she's been struggling with what ultimately is going to work for that site. Currently, it is occupied with a tenant, but her site does not qualify for the 200-foot frontage. Her site could only be really redeveloped in conjunction with the Ardell site. So the 200-foot limit for residential doesn't work for her. But the way in which the development standards are written are very important to how that site will ultimately redevelop as well. So while she would have preferred that there not be a limit on the 200-foot minimum for residential, nonetheless recognizes that some of these other development standards are going to be very helpful to the future uses of her property as well. So with that, we would just respectfully request that you recognize that you sent this issue of residential back to GPAC. GPAC has endorsed it strongly, and we would hope that you would provide that same kind of straw vote direction to the staff as they go forward on this analysis. Thank you very much.
Staff, what do we need to give you in the way of guidance related to the document that you have given us?
We would like recommendations, as we have in the other elements, the noise, housing elements tonight. We can walk you through the language changes by the GPAC. What you see here before the strikeouts were the language as the Planning Commission left it previously. This is the language you previously saw. And then the thought here was, as we have walked through the other policies of this document, were for you to provide any comment on there. The Commission did make a couple of changes, which I could articulate for you as well. The first, on page 2 of the memo, on 6.19.2, the GPAC changed the original language to basically emphasize the encouragement of the marine-related uses and clarify just a language change that doesn't affect the meaning of this, but to say, and allow the residential uses with the standards that you previously have seen. The Commission did strike.
Wait, exactly where are you?
6.19.2.
Okay, which is the handout.
The handout. 6.19.2. The Commission struck after the word "and allow" on a project-by-project basis.
Did you take it apart?
On that particular one.
Okay, we got it now.
You've got that. So again, for Mayor Pro Tem's benefit, on the second line, the Commission struck on a project-by-project basis because this would be applicable, felt that it was redundant to actually incorporate that language. Over on the next page, 6.19.8, this is the change you see here that GPAC made, which is the type underline and the type strikeout language, was really to reverse the original position. Their original position was to require that any residential on the site would be on the highway frontage and the retail uses would be on the harbor frontage. This is a reflection of the change that the GPAC made in consideration of the concepts that were presented to basically permit the properties developed for residential to locate the units along the harbor frontage, provided that a portion of the frontage is developed for the retail, restaurant, or other visitor-serving uses. This again addresses the issue that they did not see that the entirety of the harbor frontage, in any case where we have the mixture of housing and retail, should only be housing. So there was the notion that indeed a portion of the retail should open up to the harbor. It was suggested also by the architect in terms of the visitor-serving uses. Secondarily, a portion of that frontage should also incorporate the open space, the plazas, those other elements that provide the view corridors, as well as the pedestrian activity on the site as well. And then again, the next sentence was also critical, and this is the issue about the question of whether there should be a specific standard or some flexibility, is the indication that the amount of the frontage allocated for each of these uses would ultimately be determined by the city through the development plan review process. A couple of changes that were made by the Commission now. First was to assure that wherever frontage is used, the term frontage is the term would read harbor frontage, so that we're always talking in the lines about where the uses would be with the harbor frontage are developed for those uses or for the open space. Secondarily, on the 1, 2, 3 lines up from the bottom where they talk about intention to provide view corridors, they wanted also clear it was not only for view. The intention of the corridor was also be for access. So it's view and access corridors to from the highway to the harbor. So adding in the word access there. 6.19.9, and I'll read through this, require that the buildings be located in sites designed to provide, strike the word significant visual corridors. The GPAC recommended that the terminology would read clear and unobstructed views of the harbor. The Commission felt that the word unobstructed was too limiting. because the question was if you have a 3-foot shrub, that technically is an obstruction, et cetera. So what the commission went with was to design to provide clear views. So the only change they made from the GPAC was to drop the word "and unobstructed views of the harbor." They struck "and the bay." The issue was, there was a discussion in the GPAC about whether you could see the water or not. What was pointed out is the tide levels may not enable you to 100% of the time to see the water. And I think Mr. Coro on the GPAC mentioned that it's really the view of the harbor, the boats, the masts, et cetera, which is the visual asset from the highway as well. And then the only additional addition that was made by the commission was to say that at the end of the top sentence of the paragraph, it says, "in accordance with the following principles," and they added "as appropriate," recommending that some of these principles might not apply to, let's say, a smaller site, as pointed out, the smaller site here tonight, where you might not be able to modulate the building heights because it's just too small a site to do that. So the addition of the commission was to add "as appropriate" at the end of the "in accordance with the following principles," and which de facto takes out the words "and" in each of these line items as well. Again, pointing out to the council, the very last sentence here is, again, all of this will be subject to site review. It requires a site visual analysis to be conducted. It requires that that analysis then be input for decisions that would be made in a review process through the development plan review process. And those, none of the policies on the next page changed. Those were all the changes from the GPAC and the Planning Commission.
I have one other question. It's really for the applicant, though. And the project, how big was your underground garage? I mean, just in numbers.
It fills out roughly the whole site area that is dry land area of 2 levels of subterranean parking.
So that would be how many cars?
I don't have exact parking numbers with us. We did some area calculations, and it seemed to work out that we could fit the parking for all the different uses, as well as the boat uses, without any kind of parking share.
So you'd be like 300 cars or something like that, though, wouldn't you?
Yes, it is over 300 cars.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have any, Councilmember Selich?
Did the Planning Commission and GPAC select between these two approaches, the recommended general policy approach and the specific standards approach?
Yes, they selected the general policy, which is this. It's now embedded in this language.
So it's embedded in,
yes,
in all this stuff we have here. Okay, and was the Planning Commission and GPAC, were they unanimous, or were they split on those, or how did that?
Let me go to the GPAC first. The GPAC discussion as to whether it should be a specific numerical standard versus the more general approach was a split vote. The numbers were no.
It was on the residential.
16 to 11.
Yep.
It was a 16 to 11 vote in favor of the generalized approach. The GPAC actually considered it a couple of different times in the discussion. They took the vote, went back, and voted again during the course of that. And again, the primary argument against the specific numerical standard for those who supported the more generalized approach was, again, the feeling that a universal numerical application really would create problems on smaller parcels, feeling that not all size, again, not one shoe fits all sizes here, or all sizes fit whatever the cliche is here. Basically, the parcels were sufficiently different was the suggestion that they should be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, which is why the additional language was added in respect to that. Now, regarding the question of residential and regarding the other policies, there were 3 who opposed, and all of the others supported the residential and the policies then as written, which the committee considered the policies and the inclusion of residential after the first discussion about whether it should be a standard or a general approach. So it was then about, we had some 30 people there, so it was probably 27 to 3 or something of that nature. Planning Commission was unanimous.
Anybody have any further comments? Is it the pleasure of the council to accept, Sharon?
I hesitate to do this, but, Mr. Mayor, when you were making your comments earlier about the angles and having a narrower opening at the water's edge and broader at the highway so that a driver would have perhaps a better visual experience, then recalling that the Planning Commission had added the word "an access," not just a view corridor, but an access corridor. And I also began to realize that one of the things that at least I thought was good about the example we were shown tonight is that public plaza corridor is not just a view corridor, but it's a public plaza, it's an activity place, and it will draw people to the waterfront to enjoy it as opposed to just enjoying it as you drive by. And virtually everything that we've written into policy 6.19.9 deals with the view aspect of it, and we haven't really said anything about the other aspect, whether that's important to us or there needs to be some balancing of that kind of thing.
Well, it's kind of interesting that you mention that, because when you look at 16.9.9 or 19.9, and one of the things is avoidance of landscaping, fencing, parked cars, and other non-structural elements that would block the view of the harbor. So if we're taking that into consideration, the rendering we saw today that is you would not be able to see the bay except for just little tiny gaps. So when we adopt that particular standard, I think that we are severely restricting the ability of one to add the amenities that are pleasant to us. So I'm kind of curious. I'm in a little bit of a quandary.
That was precisely why the Planning Commission struck the words from the introduction and unobstructed, because they could see that just trees were partially obstructing the view.
And I think that's also adding the word "as appropriate." They wanted to provide an out.
Should we really be saying avoidance of landscaping, or should we be using a word like minimize? Or
I was going to suggest minimize.
Because if you say avoidance is an awfully restrictive word.
Minimize would get you there.
What about GPAC or Nancy? What's your feelings on that?
You should have been there. We spent so much time on this, and really, the whole issue with Mariners Mile has been views. I mean, I think that's where residential got all hung up. It was just like, weren't really thinking in terms of residential. We were always thinking in terms of views, and we always had the Bay Club in mind and that bad experience. So there's been a great deal of emotion invested in presenting a view. And one of the examples, for example, sorry, it's late, the Bay Club parking lot. Big parking lot, so in some senses you should have a shot of the harbor, but what you have is shrubs and a parking lot full of cars and more shrubs, so you have nothing to see. And so I don't think anybody, when we looked at the example here, nobody said, "Oh my God, get rid of the trees."
The cars.
Or even that. But it was this idea of the solid parking lot so you can't see through the cars, the big hedges so you can't see past the hedge into what the whole viewpoint is. So some moderation I don't think is necessarily bad, but I know that if we go too far in moderating it, we're going to have GPAC unhappy, because we really did spend a lot of time talking about being as precise as we could with the language, saying we really want minimal stuff in here, so we really do have views of the harbor.
You just used the term I used, minimize, as if you said minimal. Would you feel uncomfortable with
dwarf trees
as opposed to avoid? You wouldn't feel comfortable with that?
No, I may be shot by the other members. No, I think that if the intent is there. There's enough language in here that gives the idea of how much we want to protect it.
Okay, so minimize might work. And you may end up with bullets,
Yes, I may do
bullet
that.
holes when you get back, okay. Any other comments from the council on this? Yeah, Mrs. Daigle?
It would seem that we would need to straw vote the permitting residential, since our existing draft is that it's not permitted.
The existing draft,
Along the harbor.
oh, sorry.
Okay.
Don't we already have residential in at least one of the buildings? I don't know how it got there, but we have half and more units.
On
in
this
it.
particular site?
No, down the ways, down by John Dominus, isn't there?
We have several residential. You got the Bay Club, and you have the Towers apartment, and you have...
No, I mean, not,
you have
not
Bay
the
Shores.
heavy stuff that we put in, the Bay Club. I'm talking about was allowed by other people.
Where in here?
Isn't there, there's one unit down
one
there
or
that
two
has
lone-
24
Oh, yeah.
apartments or something. I don't know
Right
how
next
they
to-
ever
right next
got it
to-
in, but.
Right next to Josh Slocum's. There's
Yeah,
a
it's
couple
a couple little houses.
little houses in there, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, you're right. They're in there.
So my
Been there for
question is that this is actually smaller than that with a 700-foot frontage.
Okay, is it the pleasure of the council to straw vote the residential area? Okay, as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Nichols, do you want to support residential or deny it?
I think in this limited manner that we're talking about here, I have no problem.
Ms. Councilmember Daigle?
I guess my concern is we're trying to make public policy based on this watercolor, and I think I have a problem with residential along the waterfront.
Okay, so that's one yes, one no. Mr. Ridgeway?
My feelings have been known for a long time. I support the residential for all the
Okay.
reasons stated earlier.
2-1. Mr. Selich?
Well, since the Planning Commission and GPAC have both gone along with this, I'm going to support their recommendations.
That's 3. Mr. Rosansky? Okay, you said no, so I'll support residential, so it's 4-2. Does anybody have any other, staff want anything, other guidance on this?
Well, I thought that the straw vote that Councilmember Daigle had been asking for was with regard to policy 6.19.8 about the location of residential. So now the majority of the council has said, yes, we're willing to consider residential on the bay side of Coast Highway. So then the question is, on those sites, can it be on the waterfront, or do you wish to go back to the original language, which placed the retail and visitor surfing on the harbor frontage and the residential on the highway frontage?
Was that your thought, Councilmember Daigle?
I'm sorry,
I thought it was policy 6.19.8 that you were asking for the straw vote
No, I
on,
was
where
looking
the
at
residential could be located.
6.19.1, which talks
Okay.
about, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. The next item on, for consideration is the harbor element.
I defer to Ms. Wood on this one.
Once again, there is a new document that shows you the changes from the Harbor Commission. Those are shown in blue, strike out and underline, and then the changes from GPAC are shown in the yellow highlighted text. Our original staff and the consultants' original thought on the harbor and bay element, which is an existing optional element in our general plan, was to divide those goals and policies into other required elements of the general plan, in part because as we were doing the recreation element and the safety element and the natural resources element, we were adding and updating policies into those elements, some of which were repeated in the harbor element. They weren't necessarily stated the same way, and we were concerned about having internal inconsistencies, especially over time. So we had prepared the table, that's the second part of this package, that shows where every existing policy in the harbor and bay element could be found in the updated other required elements. And then the first part of this handout, our proposal had been to take the land and water use provisions out of the harbor and bay element and incorporate those into the land use element, calling the harbor and bay one of the districts, as we have with the other districts of land use. The Harbor Commission was not supportive of that approach. They felt that the harbor and bay is such a strong part of Newport Beach's character and history that it deserves having its own element. They felt that one of the valuable features of the harbor and bay element today is that it consolidates all of the policies pertaining to the harbor and bay in one place, so one doesn't have to search around all over for them. And we also found a method to take care of staff's concern about policies being repeated and having future inconsistencies, which is just a simple cross-referencing with policies repeated in both the harbor and bay element and natural resources or recreation or whatever it might be. So, so far, everyone along the way, the General Plan Advisory Committee, the Planning Commission, and staff now are supporting continuing to have a separate harbor and bay element. We didn't have time to pull it all back together, so what you see as had been proposed for the land use element would be the introductory part of the harbor and bay element, and then all of the goals and policies on the attached table would be reincorporated into a harbor and bay element. And the most significant change that was made by the GPAC and then supported by the Planning Commission, which differs from the Harbor Commission's recommendation, is with regard to the mooring transfers, where the Harbor Commission deleted the language in the introduction, calling that out as an issue, and then also deleted policy 5.18.5 about regulating the transfer of moorings. And both the General Plan Advisory Committee and the Planning Commission thought that those should be reinserted.
Okay. Anybody have any comments on the general wording before we get into the policy?
No, I do want to make a comment since I've been involved in this process forever. In the original harbor and bay element, I commend staff for supporting a separate harbor and bay element. It's probably the only one in the country, and quite candidly, it deserves the integrity of this, of its own element. So I'm clearly supportive in the direction we're headed.
Okay, policies 5.14, goals, I guess. Do we need to have any additional information on those, or can we look at them and... Anybody have any comments on 5.14?
I had a question. Given that we get funding from various sources, is the changing in language from coastal to water, does that create any difficulties in terms of obtaining grants?
What was the thought process of changing that from coastal to water?
Well, it is water in the existing element. Staff changed it to coastal because we thought the only waters that we have in Newport Beach are coastal waters. But the Harbor Commission indicated that water dependent is a commonly used term, and coastal could refer to larger coastal areas and not necessarily the waterfront, which is what they were trying to address.
And in our original harbor and bay element, we use water-dependent, water-related. That's always been the language, and it is commonly used throughout the state of California, by the way. Not coastal, but water.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody have any comments then on 1.14? No, hearing none?
One change from the Planning Commission.
Okay.
One more water-dependent activity is paddling.
Is what?
Paddling.
That's Nancy. Nancy gets behind those big boats and sucks in all that.
Paddling and kayaking.
Same difference.
Yes. Your arms, no oar.
Should we have canoeing?
Sure.
So got outrigger canoe, but yeah,
Windsurfing but was added by a harbor commissioner.
you got windsurfing in there.
We had these arguments
Are we
years
trying-
ago.
Are we trying to include everything or not? Okay.
It's a such-as list, so it's not limiting.
Okay. Anybody have any objections or comments? All right. Goal 15.15.
One comment to the council that the commission actually asked to pass forward is when you look at the goal and the policies, one of the concerns that was raised was a potential concern about consistency, because it talks about the priority along the harbor front of these uses. And the concern that was addressed was a potential inconsistency with the action that we just talked about in terms of allowing residential along not only Mariners Mile. The concern was expressed by the commission about other areas. They don't have a recommendation to you, but they wanted to raise that, to come back to this and ask staff to talk about it more in the future as we move forward and consider this, because they were inherently concerned about potentially internal consistency in the document.
Let's see, okay. Are we 15.15?
Fine with me.
15.16?
The Planning Commission had a slight language change to 5.16.2, discourage redevelopment that results in a reduction of water-dependent commercial uses. Well,
It
they
means
felt
keep
that-
the boatyards.
And they felt that redevelopment that kept those commercial uses would be fine.
Right. But even boatyards are a dying breed in terms of demand. That's why they didn't go strict, and they kept the word encourage and discourage.
Okay, let's go to 1.7, or 15 point,
5.17.
That's okay.
517, anyway, there.
It's late. Well, we can go home if you brush this thing along.
I'm trying.
Okay. Nancy wants to go.
There was a discussion on 5.17.3. Do you want to talk about that, or I'll mention it?
Oh, yes. Well,
Just the word entertainment.
yeah. One commissioner, it might have been two, wanted to delete the entertainment votes, but there wasn't sufficient support for that. Planning Commission. Pardon.
All right, we're at 5.18.
This is where the mooring transfer policy is, and the Planning Commission recommended some change in the language so that it would read, regulate the transfer of moorings to eliminate private profits and to allow public opportunities for a permit to use a mooring through a wait list. They felt that the reference to sales and acquisition should be deleted because it was their feeling that there is nothing to sell or acquire. It's a permit to use a mooring that the city issues.
That was sort of a split issue, and the question is there some legal rights to pass on a mooring? And up till now, I believe, and Mr. Ridgeway can probably confirm in spades, that you buy these moorings and there's considerable amount of money spent to them, and passing them down from one to another is a way of getting your money out of them when you're done using it and you want to pass it on to someone else. Should this only be through the city and through a list, basically?
I think it's more equitable, personally. The way they've circumvented this is a person sells their boat, the new guy buys the boat for whatever price, and then ask for a transfer into his name. They're benefiting from our asset. That's what's happening. It is the city's asset, that is the moorings, and quite candidly, what's happening is there's an inequity on the people who are on a waiting list, number one. Number two, people are benefiting, they're profiting from a value that is ours, appropriate ours. So I think this is a step in the right direction. I personally, you know, all we've been receiving is a transfer fee, and that transfer fee has been woefully inadequate. Again, when somebody's done with their mooring, rather than taking advantage of it, they should, if it has a value, again, I think the city needs to establish some kind of value, and perhaps like a golf club membership, when you sell an equity membership, the owner, you know, the owner of the membership gets 50% of the sales price. That's just the nature of the beast. So I think that same kind of concept should probably play out here. The mooring owner, we don't want to totally deprive him, but at the same time, I think if we can establish a market rate that's reasonable and share in the value, at least we're going in the right direction instead of preventing any type of, right now it's an open market, whatever the market will bear, and I think the city needs to have more control over that.
Councilmember Daigle?
Yes, I have a question for staff, specifically Dave Kiff. You're the go-to person on this subject and a lot of expertise. Do you have any concerns about the changes here, what's being presented to us?
Thanks, Councilmember Daigle. Actually, I like the wording that the Planning Commission came up with. I hadn't heard it until tonight. It sounds very appropriate.
Okay, what about on any of these other policies? Do you have any concerns?
No, the rest of the policies seem just fine.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, policy.
Maybe you want
Good
to
answer,
do a
Dave.
straw vote.
5.1, pardon?
Well, maybe you want to do a straw vote on that. I think it should be handled privately.
Okay, does anybody else want to have it handled privately? Okay, it gets handled publicly, as suggested by the Planning Commission. 5.19,
Sir?
Mr. Selich.
Yeah, I've got a suggestion to 5.19.2, and it's to add the words after existing beach profiles. I think what I wanted to add here. Oh, and to restore eroded beach profiles, so that where we have eroded beaches, we can build these structures to protect the character of those beaches also.
That's what we do annually at Balboa.
Well, that's actually what I'm thinking
Yeah.
of is the the South Bayfront's got a real problem with constant erosion, and I've noticed there's some drain pipes that hang 3 feet up above the existing sand level. So it seems that there needs to be a solution in some portions of Balboa Island that goes beyond just constantly replacing the sand, which may call for building some bulkheads or groin structures out there.
Okay, so what you're saying is to protect the character of the existing beach profiles and restore eroded profiles.
Right.
You want to add and restore eroded profile.
It happens annually. That's a good call.
May I suggest that that be a separate policy? Because the intro to this is to permit and design bulkheads and groins to protect and so forth.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, bulkheads and groins.
Oh, okay.
Well, okay, you're talking about the sand in front of the bulkheads and the groins, sand profiles in the front of it.
Create bulkheads and groins to bring back the beach. I think what Todd was referring to is where we've done sand out there to replenish the sand that's lost. So it's really two different things that you're talking about.
Okay, now I think our local coastal plan that we are working our way through doesn't allow us to build groins.
No, it does. There's a policy in there specifically that says that.
Okay. It's very difficult to get them approved, but, okay.
Particularly on Balboa Island where all the eelgrass is right now.
Okay, on 5.19.3, restore eroded profiles, yes. Which says limit structures bayward of the bulkhead lines to piers, floats, groins, and appurtenances related to marine activities. I think we should add in there, and public promenades and walkways, because we're talking about several areas that we would allow construction of facilities that could potentially be bayward, such as a cantilevered walkway.
You want to limit that?
No, not limited, but just, it lists the whole thing. It says limit structures bayward, limit structures bayward to, of the piers, to floats, groins, and appurtenances. So actually, you're right. I want to make sure that they're allowed.
That's right, yeah, you're.
Then it should be added.
Because it's just, this is language is.
It should be added.
It should be
It
added.
should be added. And then
Okay,
that
then.
would make us consistent with the circulation policy, which calls for the development of those walkways.
Okay, so.
Well, it shouldn't just be it should be cantilevered and/or.
I was just going to put public walkways.
Let's not get into the construction.
Okay.
No more
Can-
details.
Can we go home? I want to go home.
Okay.
We're just going to add public walkways.
Public walkways, that's all.
Just after groins, we'll add public walkways.
One technical item
Oh,
for
I
the
wanted public walkways before groins.
yeah, council. I'm not going to bother with the technical item.
All right, whatever. We'll let the staff figure that one out. Administration, anybody have any problems with that?
No, it's great.
5.21, adequate harbor access.
Great.
5.22,
It's great.
speak up. All right, I think we ought to go through each one of the harbor and bay element policies that are on the next 10 sheets.
These have already been reviewed by the city council when you looked at the other elements.
You're going to be here all by yourself.
Does the public have anything that they would like to comment on this item? Seeing none, we're going forward. Does the staff need any further direction on this?
No, but I would like to let you know that this concludes the review of the elements and the policies. So another big milestone. The next thing that we will have coming to you are the implementation actions, and we don't have a date for that.
Okay,
And
great.
the notice of preparation for the EIR went out last Friday, I believe it was. So we are moving on that end as well.
Okay, that item is completed, and we're now going to item S2. S2 is the confirmation of the mayor's appointments to the City Hall Site Review Committee and the Facilities Finance Review Committee. I appointed Councilmember Ridgeway, Councilmember Rosansky, and Councilmember Selich to the Site Review Committee. I reported myself, Councilmember Daigle, and Councilmember Nichols to the Finance Committee. Does the council concur with that?
Actually, you didn't. You only appointed two people, but now you're appointing.
I mentioned an alternate at the last time, and I'm recommending right now that we appoint 3 members.
Well, that's not exactly how we set it up originally.
It isn't, that's my recommendation. So if the council wishes to accept it, that's fine. If not, then let me know what you'd like to do.
Hey, I said no council members.
I know, it's fine as you change it.
It was so difficult to pick the one that got to sit out. Just figured, split it in the middle.
You know, I'll just throw it out there. The reason I said none was I didn't want I think the more council members you have on there, the more it looks like it's a council decision, and the more chance to chill the conversation, because, you know, I like to think that we're a little intimidating to the general public. I may be deluding myself, but I like to think that. And I just, personally, I think it's a mistake. You're just making it look like business as usual.
Can I make a comment to that? The Mariners Park site, the council members, Marina Park, I'm sorry, have not really participated, or very limited, almost not at all. And I'm not even sure we vote. I think we defer to the citizens. So that's how it's come in practice. And it's worked very well.
In this particular instance, the council is there to listen and answer questions as opposed to direct. And
Can we make them non-voting members? I think that
I
would be
think we are
appropriate.
non-voting members, but I think the egos up on this dais here may get the best of us. So.
Well, I would echo what Councilmember Ridgeway said earlier, less is more.
Ooh.
all right. No votes for the council members on these committees. Is that? That's what I heard. Okay.
No, I'm voting yes.
You know, I guess point of order now, because we are bringing it back because we failed to agendize it properly. I mean, are we now agendized to change the number of council members on the committee? And before, we set up a committee that was supposed to have 2 council members. I understood tonight we were appointing 2 council members. Now we're appointing 3 council members and changing the character of the committee. So it sounds to me like now we are, again, not in compliance.
I have not reviewed the resolution. Is your recollection of the
Resolution said 2
said
council
2 and
members,
1 alternate?
non-voting, and up to 11 public members.
Okay. The item that is agendized tonight, the recommendation is to confirm Mayor Webb's appointment of Mayor Pro Tem Rosansky and Council Members Selich and Ridgeway to the Site Review Committee, and the appointment of Council Members Daigle, Nichols, and Webb to the Facilities Finance Committee. So as far as the appointment of the 3 people to each committee, that is what was agendized.
But the point that I think Councilmember Rosansky's raising is that the actual configuration of the committees would only have 2 council members. So you're appointing 3 council members
For
to a
2
committee
slots.
that's only been designated to have 2 slots.
That's correct. And that was the mayor's prerogative.
Amazing what that mayor can do.
Well,
We need to
That's my
amend the,
suggestion.
no, I'm not disputing it, and ultimately we're going to do it. I'm just saying, are we going to have to come back now 2 weeks from now because we have not properly agendized adding a 3rd member, council member to the
if
committees?
upon review of the resolution and the makeup of the committee, we determine that we will need to come back, then we will have to bring it
Okay.
back.
Well,
So
just-
I'll double check.
But I'll make a motion for approval as written.
Second. All in favor? Excuse me, does the
All
public
ayes.
have anything to say? No public.
Motion carries.
City clerk,
We're just asking now for public comments on non-agenda items
public comments on non-agenda items?
and motion for reconsideration on any action taken by the council at either this meeting or a previous meeting.
All right. I guess I'm not supposed to adjourn this meeting, right? All right, no, I don't think, this is already a special meeting, and you can't adjourn a special meeting to a special meeting? Is that correct? Okay, we've set another special meeting for the 7th. The meeting is adjourned.